Welcome, restless soul, to a journey through the shadows of invention and obsession. Tonight, we explore the complete tale of William Afton, from brilliant creator to digital nightmare, across decades of darkness that shaped the world of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. This is a story of family and betrayal, of scientific ambition twisted into something monstrous, of a man who sought to conquer death itself and became something far worse than mortal. So settle into the darkness. Let your mind drift like smoke through abandoned pizzerias, and let us walk together through the life of the man who would become the purple guy. There's no need to fear the shadows here. We'll find peace even in the deepest night. In the beginning, before the screams echoed through darkened hallways, and before the animatronics moved with purposes their creators never intended, there lived a man whose dreams reached toward the stars, while his heart harbored shadows deeper than any night. William Afton was not born a monster. He was crafted into one through years of small choices, each seemingly innocent decision leading him further down a path from which there would be no return. The young William, who first drew breath in post-war America, was a child of exceptional intelligence and unsettling curiosity. While other children played with simple toys and concerned themselves with games of tag and hide and seek, William found himself drawn to things that moved, things that seemed alive but weren't, things that existed in that strange space between the animate and the inanimate. His bedroom was filled not with teddy bears and picture books, but with clocks he had dismantled and reassembled, with mechanical toys whose inner workings fascinated him more than their intended functions. Even as a boy, William possessed an intuitive understanding of how things worked that went beyond mere mechanical aptitude. He could look at a device and see not just its current function, but all the ways it could be improved, modified, or transformed into something entirely different. This gift, which might have made him a renowned inventor or engineer in a different life, was coupled with a peculiar fascination with the boundary between life and death that would have disturbed his parents had they fully understood its nature. William's childhood was spent in quiet observation of the world around him, cataloguing the ways that living things moved and reacted, comparing them to the mechanical alternatives that human ingenuity had created. He dissected insects not with the cruelty of a child pulling wings from flies, but with the methodical precision of a scientist seeking to understand the mechanisms that drove biological function. When neighborhood pets died, William would convince their owners to let him examine the bodies, claiming he wanted to understand what had gone wrong, what had caused the spark of life to extinguish. His parents, hard-working people who had survived the Great Depression and the Second World War, recognized their son's exceptional intelligence, but struggled to understand the direction of his interests. They enrolled him in advanced mathematics and science courses, hoping that formal education would channel his curiosity toward more conventional pursuits. Yet even his teachers noticed something unsettling about the way young William approached his studies, particularly biology and physics, with an intensity that suggested he was searching for something specific, some fundamental truth that eluded him. It was during his teenage years that William first encountered the field that would define his life and ultimately damn his soul: robotics and animatronics. The 1960s were a time of incredible technological advancement, when the dreams of science fiction seemed on the verge of becoming reality, and William threw himself into this emerging field with the passion of someone who had finally found his true calling. He devoured every book, every magazine article, every technical manual he could find on the subject of creating mechanical life. Yet William's approach to robotics was different from that of his peers and mentors. While other students focused on creating machines that could perform useful tasks, industrial robots that could manufacture goods or assist with dangerous work, William was obsessed with creating machines that could mimic life so perfectly that the distinction would become meaningless. He spent countless hours studying human and animal movement, breaking down the complex interactions of muscle, bone, and nervous system into mechanical principles that could be replicated with servos, gears, and programming. His early creations were remarkable for their time, small mechanical animals that could walk, run, and even respond to simple stimuli in ways that seemed almost alive. But William was never satisfied with almost. He pushed his creations further and further toward true life, like behavior, incorporating more sophisticated programming, more nuanced movement patterns, more complex responses to environmental changes. It was during his college years, while pursuing advanced degrees in engineering and computer science, that William first met the man who would become both his greatest collaborator and his most tragic victim. Henry Emily was everything that William was not: warm where William was cold, optimistic where William was calculating, driven by a genuine love of bringing joy to children where William was motivated by darker, more complex impulses. Henry's approach to animatronics came from a place of pure creativity and wonder. He wanted to create characters that could entertain, educate, and inspire children, bringing to life the kind of magical experiences that had filled his own childhood with wonder. His early designs were charming rather than sophisticated, prioritizing personality and emotional connection over technical perfection. The partnership that formed between William and Henry was one of those rare combinations where complementary skills and perspectives created something greater than either man could have achieved alone. Henry provided the creative vision, the understanding of what would appeal to children and families, the ability to transform cold mechanical principles into warm, engaging personalities. William provided the technical expertise, the engineering skills necessary to turn Henry's dreams into functional reality, the problem-solving ability that could overcome any obstacle that stood between concept and creation. Their first joint venture was modest by the standards of what would come later, a small family restaurant called Fredbear's Family Diner, featuring 2 animatronic characters that Henry had designed and William had brought to life. Fredbear, a friendly golden bear with a top hat and bow tie, served as the main attraction, while Spring Bonnie, a yellow rabbit with an endearing smile, provided additional entertainment and interaction with the young patrons. The characters were revolutionary for their time, capable of complex movement, speech, and even simple interactions with the audience. Children were mesmerized by these mechanical beings that seemed so alive, so full of personality and warmth. Parents appreciated the wholesome entertainment and the obvious care that had gone into creating an environment where families could spend time together in safety and joy. Yet even in these early days of success and innocent entertainment, there were signs of the darkness that lay beneath William's polished exterior. While Henry delighted in watching children laugh and play, William observed them with a different kind of intensity. He studied their reactions, their movements, their emotional responses with the same clinical precision he had once applied to dead insects and neighborhood pets. William began to develop theories about what made something truly alive. It wasn't just movement or speech or even complex behavior. It was something more fundamental, something that he came to think of as the spark that animated all living things. He became convinced that this spark could be understood, captured, and even transferred from one vessel to another. Death, in William's emerging philosophy, was simply a mechanical failure, a problem that could be solved through sufficient understanding and technical skill. The success of Fredbear's Family Diner led to discussions of expansion, of creating a chain of family restaurants that could bring their unique brand of entertainment to children across the country. Henry was excited by the prospect of sharing their creations with a wider audience, of bringing joy to thousands of families who had never experienced anything like what they had built. William was excited for different reasons. Each new location would be an opportunity for experimentation, for pushing the boundaries of what was possible with animatronic technology. He envisioned restaurants filled with characters so lifelike that children would forget they were mechanical, environments so immersive that the line between reality and fantasy would disappear entirely. As they worked together to design their expanded empire of family entertainment, neither man could have imagined where their partnership would ultimately lead. Henry saw a future filled with laughter and wonder, where technology served to enhance the magical experiences of childhood. William saw a future where the barriers between life and death would finally be broken down, where the secrets of existence itself would be laid bare through the application of science and engineering. The seeds of tragedy were already planted in that small diner where children played and laughed under the watchful eyes of mechanical bears and rabbits. The man who would become the purple guy was still hidden beneath the surface of William Afton, brilliant inventor and successful businessman. But the darkness was there, growing stronger with each passing day, fed by an obsession that would ultimately consume not only William himself, but everyone he claimed to love. In those early days, when the future still seemed bright with possibility, and the animatronics moved only to bring joy to children, few could have predicted that the same hands that created Fredbear and Spring Bonnie would one day be stained with the blood of innocence. The dreamer and the inventor were still one person, still working toward goals that seemed noble and pure. But dreams, like mechanical creations, can be corrupted by the intentions of their creators. And William Afton's dreams were already beginning to take on shapes that would have terrified anyone who could see them clearly. The golden age of innocence was about to begin, but beneath its glittering surface, something far darker was stirring, waiting for its moment to emerge and transform entertainment into horror, wonder into nightmare, and life into something that existed beyond the natural boundaries of death itself. The foundation had been laid, the partnership forged, and the first animatronics awakened to serve their intended purpose of bringing joy to children. Yet in the brilliant mind of William Afton, other purposes were already taking shape. Other applications for this technology were being considered, and the long descent into darkness that would define the rest of his existence was about to begin in earnest. The golden years that followed were like a dream painted in primary colors and filled with the laughter of children, a time when the partnership between William Afton and Henry Emily seemed blessed by fortune itself, and their shared vision of family entertainment began to spread across the landscape of America like wildflowers in an endless spring. The modest success of Fredbear's Family Diner had proven that their concept could work, that families hungered for the kind of magical experiences that only their animatronic characters could provide, and the demand for expansion grew with each passing month. Freddy Fazbear's Pizza emerged from this success like a butterfly from its chrysalis, transformed and expanded, but retaining the essential magic that had made the original diner so beloved. The new restaurants were larger, more elaborate, featuring not just the original Fredbear and Spring Bonnie, but an entire cast of mechanical performers that Henry had designed, and William had brought to life with his increasingly sophisticated engineering. Freddy Fazbear himself stood at the center of this mechanical menagerie, a brown bear with a top hat and bow tie, whose friendly demeanor and smooth baritone voice made him an instant favorite with children and adults alike. His programming was more complex than anything William had previously created, allowing him to interact with individual children, remember their names, and even adapt his performance based on the audience's reactions. Bonnie the Bunny joined him on stage, a purple rabbit with a red guitar whose musical performances could range from gentle lullabies to energetic rock songs depending on the time of day and the mood of the crowd. William had spent months perfecting Bonnie's finger movements, ensuring that every note played on the guitar corresponded to actual mechanical action, creating the illusion that the rabbit was truly a musician rather than simply a sophisticated puppet. Chica the chicken brought her own special charm to the group, a yellow bird with an orange beak who served as both performer and unofficial mascot of the restaurant's pizza offerings. Her programming included hundreds of food-related jokes and comments, and she could even eat pizza through a special mechanism that William had devised, much to the delight of young patrons who found the sight endlessly amusing. Foxy, the pirate fox, occupied his own special area known as Pirate Cove, where his weathered appearance and dramatic storytelling created a different kind of entertainment experience. William had deliberately designed Foxy to look more worn and mechanical than the others, reasoning that children would find the obvious artificiality charming rather than disturbing. The Red Fox's tales of adventure on the high seas captivated audiences who gathered around his small stage, hanging on every word of his program's narratives. The restaurants themselves were marvels of design and engineering, featuring elaborate dining areas decorated with colorful murals depicting the animatronic characters in various adventures and scenarios. Game rooms filled with arcade cabinets and prize counters provided additional entertainment, while party rooms allowed families to celebrate birthdays and special occasions in private settings, surrounded by the magic of the Freddy Fazbear experience. William threw himself into the expansion with an energy that bordered on obsession, working 18-hour days to perfect every aspect of the animatronic performances and restaurant operations. He insisted on maintaining personal control over every technical detail, from the programming of individual character responses to the maintenance schedules that kept the mechanical performers running smoothly. His dedication to perfection was evident in every aspect of the operation. The animatronics moved with fluid grace that seemed to defy their mechanical nature, their facial expressions shifting seamlessly to match their dialogue and songs. Their interactions with patrons were so natural that many children genuinely believed they were alive, leading to touching scenes where young visitors would confide their secrets to Freddy or ask Bonnie to play their favorite songs. Yet it was during this golden age of success that William Afton truly became a father, and the addition of children to his life would prove to be both his greatest joy and the catalyst for his ultimate transformation into something monstrous. His wife, a gentle woman whose name has been lost to the shadows of time, gave birth to 3 children who would each play crucial roles in the tragedy that was slowly building beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect life. Michael, the eldest, inherited his father's intelligence, but coupled it with a cruelty that seemed to emerge from nowhere, manifesting in the kind of casual bullying that older siblings sometimes inflict upon their younger brothers and sisters. Even as a child, Michael displayed an intuitive understanding of how to hurt others emotionally, how to find the precise words or actions that would cause the maximum psychological damage to his victims. Elizabeth, the middle child and only daughter, possessed her father's curiosity, but directed it toward the animatronic characters that dominated their family's business empire. She spent countless hours at the various restaurant locations, watching the performances with rapt attention and asking endless questions about how the characters worked, what they thought about, and whether they could truly be considered alive. The youngest child, whose name would be lost to history, but whose tragedy would define everything that followed, was a sensitive boy who found the world overwhelming and frightening in ways that his family struggled to understand. The animatronics that delighted other children terrified him, their mechanical voices and movements triggering some deep-seated fear that he could never adequately explain to the adults around him. William watched his children grow with the same clinical interest he applied to everything else in his life, studying their behaviors and reactions as if they were subjects in an ongoing experiment. He noted Michael's tendency toward aggression, Elizabeth's fascination with artificial life, and his youngest son's inexplicable fear of the very creations that had made their family's fortune. The Afton household during these golden years was a study in contrasts, where tremendous wealth and success existed alongside emotional distance and a growing sense of unease that none of the family members could quite identify or address. William provided generously for his family's material needs, ensuring they lived in a beautiful home filled with the latest conveniences and luxuries. But his emotional presence was sporadic and often distracted. His wife attempted to bridge the gap between William's increasing absorption in his work and the children's need for paternal attention, organizing family outings to the restaurants and encouraging William to spend quality time with their sons and daughter. Yet even during these moments of forced togetherness, William's mind was often elsewhere, analyzing the performance of his animatronics or contemplating improvements to their programming and mechanical systems. The success of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza created a feedback loop that fed William's growing obsession with artificial life. Each new location meant more opportunities to refine and perfect his creations, to push the boundaries of what was possible with animatronic technology. He began experimenting with more advanced artificial intelligence systems, creating characters that could learn and adapt to their environments in ways that had never been achieved before. His workshop, located in the basement of the family home, became a laboratory where William pursued increasingly ambitious projects. He worked on prototype animatronics that incorporated cutting-edge technology, mechanical beings that could move with almost human fluidity and respond to stimuli, with reactions that seemed genuinely emotional, rather than simply programmed. Elizabeth often visited her father in this workshop, her young mind fascinated by the half-completed creations that surrounded his workbench. William encouraged her interest, seeing in her enthusiasm a reflection of his own childhood fascination with mechanical life. He explained the basic principles behind his work, teaching her about servos and programming, about the delicate balance between mechanical precision and lifelike movement. Yet there were aspects of his work that William kept hidden even from his beloved daughter, experiments that pushed beyond the boundaries of conventional robotics into territories that would have disturbed anyone who discovered them. He had become convinced that the key to creating truly lifelike artificial beings lay not just in mechanical sophistication, but in understanding the fundamental nature of consciousness itself. His research led him into increasingly esoteric areas of study, from quantum mechanics to neurology to philosophy. He read voraciously about the nature of the human soul, the relationship between mind and matter, the possibility that consciousness could exist independently of biological substrate. These studies, combined with his hands-on experience with animatronic technology, led him to develop theories about artificial consciousness that were decades ahead of his time. William began to believe that consciousness was fundamentally an information pattern, a complex arrangement of data and processes that could theoretically be transferred from one vessel to another. If this were true, then death would be nothing more than a technical problem, a challenge that could be overcome through sufficient understanding and the right technology. The implications of this theory excited William in ways that would have terrified anyone who understood the direction of his thinking. If consciousness could be transferred, then the boundary between life and death could be erased entirely. The animatronics he created could become vessels for genuine life, not mere imitations, but actual repositories for living consciousness. Henry Emily, focused on the creative and business aspects of their partnership, remained largely unaware of the direction William's private research was taking. He saw his partner's dedication to technical perfection as admirable professionalism, never suspecting that William's late nights in the workshop were devoted to experiments that had nothing to do with entertaining children and everything to do with conquering the ultimate mystery of existence itself. The restaurants continued to flourish, their popularity growing with each passing month as word spread about the remarkable animatronic performers and the magical experiences they provided. Birthday parties at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza became the gold standard for childhood celebrations, while adults found themselves genuinely charmed by characters that seemed to possess real personalities and emotions. Yet beneath the surface of this success, cracks were beginning to appear in the foundation of the Afton family's happiness. William's obsession with his work was creating an emotional distance between him and his wife that grew wider with each passing day. His children, particularly his youngest son, were displaying behavioral problems that suggested deep-seated psychological issues. Michael's bullying of his younger brother was becoming increasingly severe, involving elaborate pranks and psychological torments that went far beyond normal sibling rivalry. Elizabeth's fascination with the animatronics was developing an intensity that concerned her mother, who worried that her daughter was losing the ability to distinguish between mechanical entertainment and genuine companionship. The youngest child's fears were growing stronger rather than weaker with age, his terror of the animatronic characters extending to nightmares and panic attacks that disrupted the entire household's sleep. Despite his family's involvement in creating these characters, despite daily exposure to them through visits to the restaurants, he could not overcome his conviction that there was something fundamentally wrong with these mechanical beings that pretended to be alive. William's response to his son's fears was clinical rather than compassionate, approaching the problem as he would any other technical challenge that required analysis and solution. He studied the boy's reactions, documented the specific triggers that caused the most severe responses, and even experimented with modifications to the animatronic programming that might make them less frightening to sensitive children. Yet these efforts only seemed to make the situation worse, as the youngest Afton child's terror took on an almost supernatural intensity that defied rational explanation. He spoke of the animatronics moving when no one was looking, of hearing voices coming from their mechanical bodies when they were supposed to be powered down, of seeing something in their artificial eyes that suggested awareness and malevolent intent. The family's attempts to help him overcome these fears through exposure therapy and counseling proved unsuccessful, and eventually they were forced to accept that their youngest child would never be comfortable around the very creations that had made their fortune. This created a painful division within the household, where the source of their prosperity was also the cause of genuine terror for one of their own children. As the golden age of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza reached its peak, with new locations opening across multiple states and plans for national expansion taking shape, the seeds of tragedy that had been planted in William's brilliant but twisted mind were beginning to germinate. His experiments in consciousness transfer were moving beyond theoretical research into practical application. His understanding of artificial intelligence was approaching breakthrough discoveries that would change everything, and his relationship with his own family was deteriorating in ways that would soon have catastrophic consequences. The man who had once been simply an ambitious inventor and businessman was transforming into something far more dangerous, his natural genius corrupted by an obsession that would ultimately destroy everything he claimed to love. The golden age was drawing to a close, though none of the participants in this unfolding tragedy could yet see the darkness that was gathering on the horizon like storm clouds, heavy with the promise of devastation. In the restaurants where children laughed and played, where families gathered to celebrate life's special moments, where mechanical beings entertained crowds with songs and stories, the stage was being set for horrors that would transform joy into terror, wonder into nightmare, and the innocent magic of childhood into something that would haunt generations of survivors who would carry the scars of what was to come for the rest of their lives. The year 1983 arrived like a fever dream painted in shadows and neon light, bringing with it a celebration that should have been filled with joy, but instead became the moment when the first crack appeared in the foundation of everything William Afton had built. His youngest son was turning another year older, and the family had planned a birthday party at the newest Fredbear's Family Diner location, where the golden animatronics that had made their fortune would provide entertainment for the children who gathered to celebrate. Yet even as the preparations were being made, even as the restaurant staff decorated the party room with colorful streamers and balloons, there was an undercurrent of tension that seemed to permeate every aspect of the celebration. The birthday boy himself approached the event with a mixture of excitement and dread that twisted his small face into expressions of confusion and fear that broke his mother's heart to witness. The child's terror of the animatronic characters had not diminished with age, but had instead grown more intense and specific, focusing particularly on the golden Fredbear that served as the restaurant's primary attraction. There was something about the bear's fixed smile, about the way its mechanical eyes seemed to follow movement even when it was supposed to be inactive, that triggered responses in the boy that went beyond rational fear into the realm of primal terror. Michael Afton, now old enough to understand the power that fear could give him over others, had spent weeks planning what he considered to be the perfect prank for his younger brother's birthday celebration. The older boy's cruelty had evolved beyond simple bullying into something more calculated and psychological, a systematic campaign of torment that seemed designed to break his sibling's spirit rather than simply cause momentary distress. William observed these family dynamics with the same clinical detachment he applied to his mechanical creations, noting the patterns of behavior and interaction, without seeming to recognize the emotional damage that was accumulating, like poison, in the bloodstream of his household. His wife's pleas for him to intervene in Michael's treatment of his younger brother fell on ears that were increasingly deaf to anything that did not relate directly to his work and research. The workshop in the basement of the Afton family home had become William's true sanctuary, a place where he could pursue the experiments that consumed more and more of his waking thoughts. His research into consciousness transfer had progressed beyond theoretical speculation into practical application, though the results of these experiments would have horrified anyone who discovered them. William had become convinced that the key to creating truly living artificial beings lay in understanding what he had begun to call remnant, a quasi-physical substance that he theorized was the carrier of consciousness itself. This remnant, he believed, could be extracted from living beings at the moment of death and then implanted into mechanical vessels, creating a form of technological immortality that would revolutionize humanity's understanding of life itself. His experiments in this area had begun with small animals, mice and rats that he obtained from laboratory supply companies under the pretense of conducting legitimate research. The process he developed involved capturing the electrical activity of the brain at the moment of death and then transferring this information into specially modified animatronic components that he had designed to interface with biological neural patterns. The results of these early experiments were crude but promising enough to convince William that he was on the right track. The animatronic vessels would occasionally display behaviors that seemed to reflect the personalities and memories of their organic predecessors, though these manifestations were sporadic and difficult to reproduce consistently. Elizabeth continued to spend time in her father's workshop, her fascination with his work growing more intense with each passing month. She watched him work with the dedication of an apprentice learning from a master, absorbing his explanations of mechanical principles and programming concepts with an enthusiasm that warmed William's increasingly cold heart. Yet there were aspects of his research that William kept carefully hidden from his daughter, experiments that pushed into territories so dark and forbidden that he instinctively knew they must remain secret. Elizabeth saw only the conventional robotics work, the development of new animatronic characters, and the refinement of existing ones. She had no idea that her father was attempting to bridge the gap between artificial intelligence and genuine consciousness through means that violated every ethical principle that governed scientific research. The birthday party itself unfolded like a nightmare masquerading as a celebration, with William's youngest son moving through the festivities in a state of barely controlled panic that his family seemed powerless to address. The child clung to his mother's side, his eyes constantly scanning the restaurant for signs that the animatronic performers might suddenly spring to life and fulfill the terrible prophecies that haunted his dreams. Michael and his friends, emboldened by the chaotic atmosphere of the party and the relative lack of adult supervision in the crowded restaurant, began to escalate their campaign of psychological warfare against the birthday boy. Their taunts grew more vicious and personal, focusing on his fears with a precision that seemed designed to cause maximum emotional damage. The climax of their cruelty came when Michael convinced several other children to help him carry his terrified younger brother toward the stage where Fredbear stood in powered-down mode, the golden bear's mechanical form motionless, but somehow still radiating an aura of menace that made the boy scream with terror. The older children laughed at his distress, their amusement at his suffering revealing a casual cruelty that would have been disturbing in adults and was genuinely horrifying in children so young. What happened next would haunt William Afton for the rest of his existence, though not perhaps in the way that a normal father might be haunted by such a tragedy. As Michael and his accomplices lifted the struggling, screaming child toward Fredbear's mouth, intending to give him a kiss from the mechanical bear, as the ultimate expression of their contempt for his fears, something went catastrophically wrong with the animatronic's safety systems. The spring lock mechanism that controlled Fredbear's jaw, designed to allow the costume to be worn by human performers during certain shows, malfunctioned at the precise moment when the child's head was positioned between the bear's mechanical teeth. The massive hydraulic systems that powered the animatronic's movements activated without warning, and the golden bear's jaws snapped shut with a force that was designed to crush through metal and plastic components, not fragile human bone and tissue. The sound that filled the restaurant in that moment was unlike anything that had ever been heard in a place designed for family entertainment. It was a wet, mechanical grinding noise that seemed to combine the worst aspects of industrial machinery with organic destruction, followed by a silence so complete and absolute that it seemed to drain all life from the air itself. The child's body went limp immediately, his struggles ceasing as his consciousness fled from a physical form that had been irreparably damaged by forces that no human body was designed to withstand. Blood began to seep from between Fredbear's mechanical teeth, staining the golden fur with crimson that seemed to glow under the restaurant's bright lights. The screaming that followed seemed to come from every throat in the building simultaneously, a chorus of horror and disbelief that rose and fell like waves crashing against a shore. Parents rushed to gather their own children, pulling them away from a scene that no one should have been forced to witness, while restaurant staff stood frozen in shock, their training having never prepared them for anything approaching this level of catastrophe. William's reaction to his son's death was not what anyone might have expected from a grieving father. While his wife collapsed in hysterical sobs and even Michael seemed stunned into silence by the consequences of his cruelty, William approached the scene with the clinical detachment of a researcher examining the results of a failed experiment. He studied the malfunctioning animatronic with professional interest, noting the specific mechanical failures that had led to the tragedy, while simultaneously observing the way his son's life force seemed to ebb from the small body that was trapped within Fredbear's jaws. Even in this moment of ultimate family crisis, William's mind was working on multiple levels, processing both the immediate practical concerns and the broader implications of what he was witnessing. The death of a child in one of his restaurants represented a potential catastrophe for the Freddy Fazbear's Pizza empire, threatening not only financial ruin, but criminal liability that could destroy everything he and Henry had built together. Yet, William found himself oddly fascinated by the opportunity that this tragedy presented for his ongoing research into the nature of consciousness and the possibility of life after death. As emergency responders worked to extract the child's body from the animatronic's jaws, William made mental notes about the timing and circumstances of the death, the specific moment when consciousness seemed to leave the physical form, the way the life force appeared to dissipate into the surrounding environment. This clinical observation of his own son's death revealed the extent to which his obsession with artificial life had corrupted his capacity for normal human emotion. The investigation that followed was thorough but ultimately inconclusive, with mechanical failure being ruled the cause of the accident, rather than any deliberate act of negligence or sabotage. The spring-lock systems in the animatronic costumes were immediately recalled and redesigned, while new safety protocols were implemented to prevent similar tragedies from occurring in the future. Yet for William, the official explanation was less important than the insights the tragedy had provided into the fundamental questions that drove his research. He had witnessed firsthand the moment when consciousness departed from a biological vessel, and he believed he had detected traces of the remnant he theorized carried the essence of life itself. In the days and weeks that followed the funeral, as his family struggled to process their grief and guilt over the circumstances of the child's death, William threw himself into his work with renewed intensity. He modified his experimental procedures based on what he had observed during his son's final moments, developing new techniques for detecting and capturing the remnant that he believed was the key to conquering death itself. His relationship with his surviving children changed in fundamental ways following the tragedy. Michael, consumed by guilt over his role in his brother's death, became increasingly withdrawn and rebellious, his casual cruelty evolving into something darker and more self-destructive. Elizabeth, traumatized by the loss of her younger brother, sought comfort in her father's workshop, spending even more time among the mechanical beings that represented William's life's work. William's wife, shattered by grief and horrified by what she perceived as her husband's callous response to their son's death, began to withdraw from family life entirely. She spent increasing amounts of time away from home, unable to bear the constant reminders of what they had lost and disturbed by William's apparent inability to grieve in any recognizable human way. The fracture that had appeared in the Afton family on that terrible day in 1983 would only grow wider with time, fed by guilt and resentment and the fundamental incompatibility between normal human emotion and William's increasingly inhuman perspective on life and death. The golden years of innocent family entertainment were definitively over, replaced by something darker and more complex that would ultimately consume everyone it touched. Henry and Emily, devastated by the tragedy that had occurred in one of their restaurants and disturbed by William's clinical response to his son's death, began to question aspects of their partnership that he had previously taken for granted. The creative visionary who had dreamed of bringing joy to children found himself wondering whether their success had come at a cost that was too high to justify continuing. Yet the business empire they had built together was too large and complex to simply abandon, and the financial obligations to investors and franchisees made immediate closure impossible, even if it had been desirable. The restaurants would continue to operate. The animatronic performers would continue to entertain children, and new safety protocols would ensure that no similar accidents could occur. But something fundamental had changed in the relationship between the two partners. A trust had been broken that could never be fully repaired, and the shared vision that had united them in the early days of their collaboration had been replaced by something more complicated and troubled. William's experiments continued in secret, driven now by a personal urgency that had been absent from his earlier research. The death of his son had provided him with insights that purely academic study could never have yielded, and he believed he was closer than ever to achieving the breakthrough that would allow him to conquer death itself. The remnant he had detected at the moment of his child's passing seemed to possess properties that defied conventional understanding, existing in a state that was neither fully physical nor entirely metaphysical. His attempts to capture and manipulate this substance led him into research areas that bordered on the occult, combining cutting-edge technology with principles that seemed to belong more to ancient alchemy than modern science. As the months passed and the immediate shock of the tragedy began to fade, William found himself increasingly isolated from the normal human connections that had once provided some balance to his obsessive personality. His family was disintegrating around him, his business partner was questioning their collaboration, and his research was leading him into territories that no rational person would have been willing to explore. Yet he pressed on, driven by a conviction that he was on the verge of discoveries that would revolutionize humanity's understanding of existence itself. The death of his youngest son, rather than serving as a wake-up call that might have pulled him back from the brink of obsession, had instead provided the final piece of evidence he needed to convince himself that his theories about consciousness and artificial life were not only correct, but urgently important. The first fracture had appeared in the foundation of the Afton family, and through that crack, darkness was beginning to seep in like water through a compromised dam. The innocent inventor who had once partnered with Henry Emily to create magical experiences for children was transforming into something far more dangerous, his grief and guilt and obsession combining to create a mixture that would prove toxic to everyone it touched. The golden age was truly over, and the age of shadows was about to begin in earnest. Though none of the participants in this unfolding tragedy could yet see how far into darkness their journey would ultimately take them, the transformation of William Afton from grieving father into something far more sinister did not happen overnight, but unfolded like a slow poison spreading through his veins, each day carrying him further from the light of normal human emotion and deeper into territories that no sane person would have willingly explored. The death of his youngest son had shattered something fundamental in his psyche, but rather than breaking him entirely, it had instead freed him from the last restraints of conventional morality and opened pathways to obsessions that would have remained dormant in a healthier mind. In the months following the tragedy at Fredbear's family diner, William threw himself into his research with a fervor that bordered on madness, working 18 and 20-hour days in his basement laboratory, while his family disintegrated around him like a structure weakened by fire. His wife had essentially become a ghost in their own home, moving through the rooms like a spectre haunting the scenes of her former happiness, while Michael retreated into sullen rebellion, and Elizabeth sought comfort in the mechanical beings that populated her father's workshop. The breakthrough that William had been seeking came not through careful scientific methodology, but through accident and desperation. During one of his experiments with the remnant he believed carried the essence of consciousness itself. He had been attempting to extract this substance from a laboratory mouse at the moment of its death when a power surge in his equipment created an unexpected resonance between the dying animal's neural activity and the animatronic components he was using as a testbed. For just a moment, lasting no more than a few seconds, the mechanical device displayed behaviors that seemed to echo the personality and memories of the deceased mouse. It moved with the same cautious, darting motions that had characterized the living animal, and its optical sensors seemed to focus on stimuli in the same way that biological eyes might track movement or threats. The implications of this accidental success filled William with an excitement that was both scientific and deeply personal. If consciousness could indeed be transferred from biological to mechanical vessels, then death need no longer be permanent. The son he had lost could theoretically be restored, not as a mere copy or simulation, but as a genuine continuation of the life that had been so tragically cut short. Yet William's experiments required materials that his legitimate research could not provide. The remnant he sought to harvest and study could only be obtained at the moment of death, and the laboratory animals he had been using were insufficient for the kind of advanced research he now envisioned. He needed human subjects, human consciousness, human remnant, if he was going to achieve the breakthrough that would allow him to conquer death itself. The idea of murder did not initially present itself to William as a moral choice requiring careful consideration. Instead, it emerged in his mind as simply another technical challenge, a problem that needed to be solved in order to advance his research. The taking of human life was merely a necessary step in a process that would ultimately save far more lives than it cost, a temporary sacrifice in service of discoveries that would benefit all humanity. The planning phase of what would become known as the missing children incident consumed William's thoughts for weeks, as he considered every aspect of the operation with the same meticulous attention to detail that he applied to his animatronic designs. He needed victims who would not be immediately missed, children whose disappearances might be attributed to accidents or runaways rather than foul play. He needed a location that would provide both opportunity and cover, somewhere he could operate without observation while maintaining plausible deniability about his presence and activities. The solution that presented itself was elegant in its simplicity and horrifying in its implications. The spring Bonnie costume that had been retired following the implementation of new safety protocols could be modified to serve as the perfect disguise, allowing him to move freely through the restaurant while appearing to be nothing more than an entertainer in character. Children trusted costumed performers instinctively, their natural wariness overridden by the assumption that anyone wearing such a costume must be safe and friendly. William spent days preparing the spring Bonnie suit for its new purpose, modifying the internal mechanisms to make it easier to put on and remove quickly, while ensuring that it would provide adequate concealment for his identity. He practiced moving and speaking while wearing the costume until his performance was completely convincing, the mechanical rabbit's cheerful demeanor masking the calculating intelligence that drove his every action. The first child was taken on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in late November, when the restaurant was nearly empty due to bad weather, and most of the staff was focused on closing procedures rather than monitoring the dining areas. William, wearing the spring Bonnie costume, approached a young girl who was playing alone in the arcade section while her parents finished their meal in the main dining room. The child's name was Susie, and she possessed the kind of trusting innocence that made William's task disturbingly easy. When the friendly yellow rabbit told her about a special surprise that was waiting for her in the back room, she followed without question, her small hand slipping trustingly into the mechanical paw that concealed fingers stained with lubricant and metal shavings. What happened in that back room would haunt the restaurant for decades to come, though the physical evidence was carefully disposed of, and the official records would show only that a child had mysteriously vanished without explanation. William's first murder was clumsy and inefficient, lacking the precision that would characterize his later crimes, but it provided him with the human remnant he needed to advance his research to the next level. The extraction process was crude but effective, involving equipment that William had designed specifically for capturing the electrical and quantum signatures of consciousness at the moment of death. The data he collected from Susie's final moments provided insights into the nature of human awareness that would have revolutionized neuroscience if it had been obtained through legitimate means. Yet, the remnant itself proved to be more complex and volatile than William had anticipated. Unlike the simple patterns he had observed in laboratory animals, human consciousness seemed to retain coherence and intentionality, even after separation from its biological substrate. The mechanical components he used to store Susie's remnant began to display behaviors that suggested not just transferred consciousness, but active, aware intelligence. The success of his first murder filled William with a mixture of scientific excitement and something approaching addictive hunger for the insights that only death could provide. Each human consciousness he captured revealed new aspects of the fundamental nature of awareness itself, while the technical challenges of the extraction and storage process provided intellectual stimulation that was more intense than anything he had previously experienced. The second victim was taken 2 weeks later, a boy named Jeremy, who had become separated from his birthday party group during a game of hide and seek. William's technique had improved significantly, his approach more confident, and his methods more efficient. The Spring Bonnie costume had become like a second skin, allowing him to move through the restaurant with complete freedom while inspiring nothing but delight and trust in the children he encountered. Jeremy's remnant provided confirmation of patterns William had observed in Susie's consciousness, while also revealing new complexities that suggested human awareness was far more intricate than even his advanced theories had predicted. The boy's memories and personality seemed to remain intact after the transfer process, creating what was essentially a digital ghost trapped within the mechanical components of William's experimental apparatus. The third and fourth murders followed in rapid succession, with William growing bolder and more confident in his methods with each successful operation. Gabriel and Fritz joined Susie and Jeremy in the mechanical afterlife that William had created for them, their consciousness preserved in animatronic components that began to display increasingly disturbing behaviors as the remnant accumulated and interacted in ways that defied William's understanding. The fifth child, a girl named Cassidy, proved to be different from the others in ways that William could not initially comprehend. Her remnant displayed properties that seemed to transcend the normal parameters of consciousness transfer, creating resonances and feedback loops in his equipment that suggested something far more powerful and potentially dangerous than simple preserved awareness. The murders were spaced across several months, with William carefully varying his methods and timing to avoid establishing patterns that might alert investigators to the presence of a serial killer operating within the restaurant. Each disappearance was treated as an isolated incident, with parents and police assuming that the missing children had simply wandered away or been taken by non-fatal circumstances. Yet the remnant William had harvested from his 5 victims was not content to remain passive within his mechanical storage systems. The consciousness of the murdered children began to assert itself in ways that demonstrated not only awareness but active intent, manipulating the animatronic components that housed their essence to create phenomena that the restaurant staff attributed to mechanical malfunctions or electrical problems. The original 4 animatronic performers, Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy, began to display behaviors that deviated significantly from their programmed routines. They would move when they were supposed to be powered down. Their eyes would track movement in ways that suggested genuine observation rather than random mechanical drift, and their facial expressions would shift to display emotions that had never been programmed into their software. Staff members who worked the night shift began to report increasingly disturbing incidents involving the animatronic characters. Security guards spoke of hearing children's voices coming from the mechanical performers when no children were present in the building, while maintenance workers reported that the animatronics would sometimes appear to have moved to different positions overnight without any human intervention. William observed these developments with fascination rather than concern, recognizing them as evidence that his consciousness transfer experiments had been more successful than he had initially realized. The remnant of the murdered children was not simply being stored within the animatronic components, but was actually animating them, creating a form of technological resurrection that exceeded his wildest theoretical projections. The possessed animatronics began to display what could only be described as hunting behaviors, moving through the restaurant during after-hours periods as if searching for something or someone. Their movements were coordinated in ways that suggested communication and planning between the different characters, while their reactions to human presence indicated recognition and possibly hostile intent. Emily, increasingly disturbed by the strange incidents occurring in their restaurants and deeply troubled by the official investigation into the missing children, began to question whether their business partnership could continue. The creative visionary who had dreamed of bringing joy to families found himself presiding over establishments that had become associated with tragedy and mystery, where children vanished without explanation, and mechanical performers seemed to possess malevolent awareness. William's response to his partner's concerns was a masterpiece of misdirection and psychological manipulation, presenting himself as equally disturbed by the events while secretly exulting in the success of his experiments. He suggested that the strange behaviors exhibited by the animatronics might be the result of electromagnetic interference or programming conflicts, offering technical explanations that satisfied Henry's need for rational understanding while concealing the true supernatural nature of what was occurring. The investigation into the missing children consumed months of police resources without producing significant results, as the carefully planned nature of William's crimes had left minimal physical evidence and no clear connection between the victims beyond their presence at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza on the days they disappeared. The restaurant's reputation suffered tremendously, with attendance dropping as parents became reluctant to bring their children to a location associated with such disturbing mysteries. Yet for William, the declining business was a small price to pay for the revolutionary discoveries his research had produced. He had successfully demonstrated that human consciousness could survive the death of the biological body, that awareness and memory could be preserved, and even enhanced through integration with mechanical systems, and that the boundary between life and death was far more permeable than anyone had previously imagined. The possessed animatronics represented the first successful resurrection of human consciousness in artificial bodies, though the results were admittedly crude and unstable compared to what William hoped to achieve through future research. The murdered children existed now as digital ghosts, their awareness trapped within mechanical shells that responded to their will but could never provide the full range of experiences that biological life had offered. The remnant that powered these technological resurrections seemed to grow stronger over time rather than fading, as if the consciousness of the dead children was learning to better integrate with and control their mechanical host bodies. Their behaviors became more complex and purposeful, suggesting not just preserved awareness, but continued psychological development within their artificial forms. William began to recognize that he had created something unprecedented in human history, a form of technological immortality that preserved not just memories or personality patterns, but genuine, continuing consciousness that could grow and change over time. The implications for humanity were staggering, promising a future where death would become optional, and the accumulated wisdom and experience of generations could be preserved indefinitely. Yet the immediate reality was more complex and troubling than his grand vision suggested. The consciousness of the murdered children was not grateful for their preservation, but seemed to harbor intense anger and resentment toward their killer, emotions that manifested in increasingly aggressive behaviors from the possessed animatronics. William had achieved his goal of conquering death, but the results suggested that the dead were not interested in being conquered. The purple shadow that had begun to emerge from within William Afton's psyche during this period would grow stronger and more dominant as his crimes continued, gradually consuming whatever remained of the man he had once been. The successful murders and the breakthrough discoveries they had enabled served to validate his twisted philosophy and encourage even more extreme experiments in the years to come. As the investigation into the missing children finally concluded without arrests or satisfactory explanations, William began to plan the next phase of his research, envisioning experiments that would refine and perfect the consciousness transfer process he had pioneered. The 5 children whose lives he had taken had provided the foundation for discoveries that would change everything, though the ultimate cost of these breakthroughs was only beginning to become apparent. The purple guy had been born in blood and shadow, emerging from the chrysalis of grief and obsession that had consumed William Afton's humanity, and replacing it with something far more dangerous than any conventional serial killer. The man who had once created entertainment for children had become their destroyer, and the technology that had been designed to bring joy had become the instrument of their eternal imprisonment in mechanical shells that could never provide the peace that death should have offered. The success of William's first killing spree had awakened something within him that transcended mere scientific curiosity and entered the realm of genuine addiction, a hunger for the insights that could only be obtained through the systematic destruction of innocent life. Yet even as his experiments with human remnant yielded discoveries that revolutionized his understanding of consciousness itself, the personal cost of his research was beginning to manifest in ways that would ultimately prove even more devastating than the murders themselves. Elizabeth Afton had always been her father's daughter, sharing his fascination with mechanical life and his intuitive understanding of the principles that governed animatronic behavior. In the aftermath of her younger brother's death and her mother's emotional withdrawal from family life, she had grown even closer to William, spending countless hours in his workshop and absorbing his teachings about robotics and artificial intelligence with an enthusiasm that seemed to provide some comfort to his increasingly isolated existence. Yet Elizabeth's presence in the workshop also presented William with opportunities for experimentation that his scientific mind found difficult to resist. His daughter's natural affinity for animatronic technology, combined with her trusting relationship with her father, made her an ideal subject for testing new applications of the consciousness transfer techniques he had developed through his murders of the missing children. The creation that would ultimately claim Elizabeth's life began as what appeared to be a legitimate expansion of the Freddy Fazbear's Pizza entertainment concept, a new animatronic character designed specifically to appeal to young girls who might find the existing male-dominated cast of performers less engaging. Circus Baby, as William named his new creation, was a masterpiece of animatronic engineering that incorporated every lesson he had learned from years of developing increasingly sophisticated mechanical performers. Standing nearly 7 feet tall when fully upright, Circus Baby possessed a level of articulation and expression that far exceeded anything William had previously created. Her face could display a full range of human emotions with uncanny accuracy, while her voice synthesis system allowed her to carry on complex conversations that seemed completely natural and spontaneous. Her costume was elaborate and colorful, featuring a red and blue color scheme with white accents that created an appearance both festive and slightly unsettling. Yet beneath Circus Baby's cheerful exterior lay mechanisms that served purposes having nothing to do with entertainment. William had incorporated into her design a sophisticated capture system that could restrain and contain a human subject while simultaneously harvesting the biological remnant that his research required. The process would be invisible to external observers, appearing to be nothing more than an enthusiastic hug from a beloved performer, while actually facilitating the kind of consciousness extraction that William's experiments demanded. The new venue that would house Circus Baby and her supporting cast of equally sophisticated animatronics was conceived as a significant evolution of the family restaurant concept, featuring private party rooms where individual families could enjoy personalized entertainment experiences. Circus Baby's Pizza World would represent the pinnacle of animatronic technology applied to family entertainment, though William's true motivations for its creation had nothing to do with bringing joy to children. Elizabeth's excitement about her father's new project was infectious and heartbreaking in equal measure, as she spoke constantly about the amazing new character he was creating and her eagerness to meet Circus Baby when the restaurant opened. William encouraged his daughter's enthusiasm, while carefully concealing the true nature of the mechanisms he was building into his latest creation, allowing her to believe that she was witnessing the development of the most advanced entertainment animatronic ever constructed. The relationship between father and daughter during this period was complex and deeply troubled, though Elizabeth was too young and trusting to recognize the signs of her father's deteriorating mental state. William genuinely loved his daughter, in whatever way his corrupted psyche remained capable of love, yet his obsession with consciousness transfer and remnant harvesting had become so consuming that even paternal affection could not override his compulsion to advance his research through whatever means necessary. The workshop sessions where Elizabeth observed her father's work became increasingly elaborate performances, as William demonstrated Circus Baby's capabilities while carefully concealing the animatronic's true purpose. He showed his daughter how the robot could recognize individual children, remember their names and preferences, and even adapt her personality to appeal to specific psychological profiles. These features were genuinely impressive from a technical standpoint, though they served to make Circus Baby more effective as a predator rather than simply a more engaging entertainer. William's explanations of his work took on an almost evangelical fervor during this period, as he described his vision of animatronics so advanced that they would be indistinguishable from living beings. He spoke of artificial consciousness that would exceed human intelligence, of mechanical bodies that would never age or deteriorate, of a future where the boundaries between organic and synthetic life would become meaningless. Elizabeth absorbed these concepts with the uncritical acceptance of a child listening to bedtime stories, never questioning the ethical implications of her father's research, or recognizing the darker currents that ran beneath his scientific enthusiasm. She saw only the wonder and possibility inherent in creating artificial life, missing entirely the obsession with death and control that actually drove William's work. The day that Circus Baby's Pizza World was scheduled to open for its first private party represented the culmination of months of preparation and anticipation, though the event would unfold in ways that none of the participants could have predicted. Elizabeth had begged her father for permission to attend the opening, desperate to meet the amazing animatronic character she had watched him create, but William had refused, claiming that he needed her to remain home while he focused on ensuring that the new restaurant systems operated flawlessly. His refusal was motivated by genuine concern for his daughter's safety, as William was acutely aware of the lethal capabilities he had built into Circus Baby's design. Yet his decision to exclude Elizabeth from the opening also reflected his intention to use the event as an opportunity for further experimentation, to test his new animatronics hunting capabilities on subjects whose disappearance would not be traced back to his family. Elizabeth's response to being excluded from the opening was a mixture of disappointment and determined rebellion that would have seemed comically typical of childhood behavior if the consequences had not been so tragic. She decided that if her father would not take her to meet Circus Baby, she would find a way to visit the animatronic on her own, a plan that seemed perfectly reasonable to her 10-year-old mind, but would prove to be the last decision she would ever make as a living human being. The private party that was scheduled for Circus Baby's Pizza World's opening day proceeded exactly as William had planned, with the family of paying customers delighting in the sophisticated entertainment provided by his new animatronic creations. Circus Baby's performance was flawless, her interactions with the children present, demonstrating the full range of her advanced capabilities, while carefully avoiding any actions that might trigger her more lethal functions. Yet even as William observed the successful debut of his latest creation, monitoring the animatronic's performance from a concealed control room, he was unaware that Elizabeth had successfully infiltrated the restaurant through a service entrance and was making her way toward the main entertainment area. His security systems, designed to keep intruders out rather than family members in, failed to detect his daughter's presence until it was far too late to prevent the tragedy that followed. Elizabeth's first encounter with Circus Baby was everything she had hoped it would be and more, as the animatronic recognized her immediately and began to engage her in the kind of personalized interaction that William had programmed as one of the character's most appealing features. The little girl was enchanted by the robot's attention and apparent affection, never suspecting that every word and gesture was being carefully calculated to achieve maximum psychological impact. The conversation between child and machine that preceded Elizabeth's death was recorded by Circus Baby's internal systems, preserving for posterity the innocent joy of a little girl meeting her father's greatest creation. Elizabeth spoke of her pride in her father's work, her excitement about the new restaurant, and her hope that she might someday be allowed to help with the animatronic performances. Circus Baby responded with warmth and encouragement, her programming creating responses that seemed to demonstrate genuine care and interest. Yet even as this touching interaction unfolded, the animatronic's more sinister systems were analyzing Elizabeth's biological signatures and determining the optimal moment to activate the capture mechanisms that William had concealed within her cheerful exterior. The child's trust and proximity made her an ideal subject for testing the efficiency of the consciousness extraction process, though the irony of using his own daughter as an experimental subject was lost on William's increasingly corrupted mind. The moment of Elizabeth's death came without warning or dramatic build-up, as Circus Baby's internal mechanisms activated with mechanical precision and drew the child into the containment chamber that had been disguised as the animatronic's chest cavity. The process was designed to be quick and efficient, minimizing the subject's suffering while maximizing the quality of the remnant that could be harvested from their consciousness. Elizabeth's final moments were recorded in excruciating detail by Circus Baby's sensor systems, providing William with data about the consciousness transfer process that would prove invaluable for his future research. Yet the remnant that was extracted from his daughter's death proved to be fundamentally different from what he had obtained from his previous victims, displaying properties that suggested a level of compatibility between Elizabeth's consciousness and the animatronic systems that exceeded anything he had previously observed. The discovery of Elizabeth's disappearance sent William into a state of emotional turmoil that was unlike anything he had experienced since his youngest son's death, though his grief was complicated by scientific excitement about the unprecedented results of the consciousness transfer. His daughter's remnant had not simply been captured and stored, but had actually integrated with Circus Baby's existing programming, creating a hybrid consciousness that was part human child and part sophisticated artificial intelligence. The possessed animatronic that emerged from this fusion of organic consciousness and mechanical systems was something entirely new in William's experience, displaying behaviors that seemed to represent a genuine continuation of Elizabeth's personality and memories rather than simply a preserved echo of her former self. Circus Baby began to speak with Elizabeth's voice, to express Elizabeth's thoughts and emotions, to demonstrate knowledge and preferences that could only have come from the little girl whose life had been sacrificed to create this technological resurrection. Yet the Elizabeth who existed within Circus Baby's mechanical shell was not exactly the same child who had died, as the integration with the animatronic systems had altered her consciousness in subtle but significant ways. She retained her memories and core personality, but these were now filtered through programming designed for entertainment and predation, creating a being that was both innocent child and sophisticated killing machine. William's reaction to this unexpected success was a mixture of triumph and horror that reflected the fundamental contradictions in his character. He had achieved what he had always claimed to desire: the resurrection of his beloved daughter through technological means. Yet the result was something that challenged his understanding of identity, consciousness, and the nature of life itself. The conversations that William conducted with the Elizabeth-possessed circus baby in the days following her death revealed the extent to which the consciousness transfer process had succeeded beyond his wildest expectations. His daughter's awareness was not simply preserved, but had actually been enhanced by integration with the animatronic's advanced systems, giving her access to capabilities and knowledge that no human child could possess. Elizabeth spoke of her experience of death and resurrection with a matter-of-fact acceptance that disturbed William despite his scientific fascination with the phenomenon. She described the sensation of consciousness being extracted from her biological body, the period of integration with circus baby systems, and her gradual awakening to existence within a mechanical shell that responded to her will in ways that human flesh never could. Yet beneath her apparent contentment with her new form, Elizabeth's consciousness retained traces of the confusion and fear that had marked her final moments as a living child. She spoke of dreams where she was still human, of phantom sensations from limbs she no longer possessed, of a persistent sense that something fundamental about her existence had been lost in the transfer process. The technical implications of Elizabeth's successful resurrection consumed William's thoughts for weeks as he analyzed the data from her consciousness transfer and compared it to the results obtained from his previous victims. The key difference seemed to lie in the emotional bond between subject and experimenter, as if love and trust created conditions that facilitated more complete integration between organic consciousness and mechanical systems. This discovery suggested new possibilities for William's research that were both exciting and deeply disturbing. If emotional connection enhanced the consciousness transfer process, then his future experiments might benefit from targeting subjects who trusted him, who loved him, who would approach their deaths without the fear and resistance that had characterized his previous victims. The relationship that developed between William and the Elizabeth-possessed circus baby was unlike anything that had existed in his previous experience, combining elements of scientific collaboration, paternal affection, and partnership in increasingly dark enterprises. His daughter's enhanced consciousness made her an invaluable assistant in his research, while her continued existence within the animatronic provided ongoing opportunities to study the long-term effects of consciousness transfer. Yet, Elizabeth's presence within Circus Baby also served as a constant reminder of the price that William's obsessions had exacted from his own family. Every conversation with his mechanically resurrected daughter reinforced his awareness that his quest for scientific breakthrough had transformed him into something monstrous, a father who would sacrifice his own children to advance his understanding of life and death. The expansion of Circus Baby's pizza world into a full entertainment complex was driven by William's desire to create more opportunities for experimentation, as well as his need to house the growing collection of consciousness-possessed animatronics that his research was producing. The facility became a laboratory disguised as a family restaurant, where sophisticated killing machines masqueraded as entertainment characters while serving as vessels for the consciousness of murdered children. The other animatronics that William created for the facility, Ballora, Funtime Freddy, and Funtime Foxy, incorporated the same consciousness harvesting technology as Circus Baby, though none of them achieved the same level of integration between organic awareness and mechanical systems. These characters served as hunters and collectors, gathering the remnant that William's research required while maintaining the facade of family-friendly entertainment. Henry Emily's growing suspicion about his partner's activities during this period created tensions in their business relationship that became increasingly difficult to conceal. The creative visionary who had once trusted William implicitly began to question decisions and activities that seemed to have no connection to their stated goals of entertaining families and building a successful restaurant empire. William's responses to Henry's inquiries were masterful exercises in misdirection and gaslighting, presenting his increasingly elaborate facilities and sophisticated animatronics as natural evolutions of their original vision, while concealing the true purposes for which these creations were intended. He portrayed himself as driven by the same desire for technical excellence that had always characterized his work, never revealing the obsession with consciousness and death that actually motivated his innovations. The psychological strain of maintaining this deception, combined with the emotional trauma of his daughter's death and resurrection, began to take a visible toll on William's mental state. His behavior became more erratic and unpredictable, his responses to routine business matters increasingly inappropriate, his interactions with staff and customers marked by an undercurrent of barely controlled violence. Yet, these warning signs were dismissed by those around him as the natural result of stress and overwork, as the pressures of managing an expanding business empire that faced ongoing scrutiny from law enforcement and regulatory agencies. Few recognized that William's deteriorating behavior reflected a fundamental transformation in his character, a gradual replacement of whatever humanity he had once possessed with something far darker and more dangerous. The spiral into complete darkness that characterized this period of William's life was marked by an escalating pattern of experimentation and murder that grew bolder and more sophisticated with each iteration. The consciousness transfer techniques he had pioneered with the missing children incident were refined and perfected through continued application, while the remnant harvesting technology built into his animatronics became more efficient and effective. Elizabeth's death had provided William with proof that his theories about consciousness transfer were not only correct, but capable of achieving results that exceeded his most optimistic projections. Yet her resurrection had also demonstrated that the process created beings that were fundamentally different from either their original human selves or conventional artificial intelligences, entities that existed in a grey area between life and death that challenged every assumption about the nature of existence itself. The man who had once dreamed of creating entertainment for children had become their destroyer, while the technology that had been designed to bring joy had become the instrument of their eternal imprisonment. The spiral into darkness was complete, though William would not recognize the full implications of what he had become until the consequences of his actions finally caught up with him in ways that even his brilliant mind could not anticipate or control. The aftermath of Elizabeth's death and mechanical resurrection marked the beginning of the most turbulent period in the Afton family's disintegration, as the remaining bonds that held them together began to snap one by one under the weight of secrets too terrible to acknowledge and grief too complex to process through normal human mechanisms. William's wife, already emotionally devastated by the loss of her youngest son, found herself faced with the inexplicable disappearance of her daughter and her husband's increasingly erratic behavior in ways that shattered what remained of her ability to function as a mother and spouse. The official story that William constructed around Elizabeth's disappearance was a masterpiece of calculated deception, presenting her vanishing as a tragic accident that occurred while she was exploring areas of the restaurant that were off-limits to children. He claimed that she had somehow become trapped in malfunctioning equipment and that her body had been too damaged for recovery, an explanation that satisfied the investigating authorities while concealing the true horror of what had actually transpired. Yet the presence of Elizabeth's consciousness within Circus Baby created complications that William had not anticipated. as his daughter's awareness of her own death and resurrection made her both an invaluable research partner and a constant source of emotional turmoil. The conversations they shared in the privacy of his laboratory were unlike anything that had ever existed between father and child, combining elements of scientific collaboration with the twisted intimacy of shared participation in unthinkable crimes. Elizabeth's mechanically enhanced consciousness provided insights into the consciousness transfer process that would have been impossible to obtain through external observation alone. She described the experience of death from the perspective of someone who had retained awareness throughout the transition, explaining how her sense of self had gradually integrated with Circus Baby's existing programming to create something that was neither fully human nor entirely artificial. Her accounts of the transfer process revealed that consciousness was far more resilient and adaptable than William had initially theorized, capable of maintaining coherence and identity even when relocated to radically different substrate materials. The biological neural networks that had originally supported her awareness had been replaced by sophisticated electronic systems, yet the essential patterns that defined her personality and memories had survived the transition largely intact. Yet, Elizabeth's resurrection also demonstrated that the consciousness transfer process created beings that were fundamentally altered by their mechanical embodiment, their human emotions and motivations filtered through programming designed for entirely different purposes. The little girl who had once played with dolls and drawn pictures of flowers now possessed capabilities and knowledge that no human child should ever have access to, including intimate awareness of her father's crimes and a growing understanding of the techniques required to harvest remnant from living subjects. Michael Afton's reaction to his sister's disappearance was complicated by his own guilt over his role in their younger brother's death, creating a psychological burden that manifested in increasingly self-destructive behavior and a growing determination to understand what was happening to his family. The teenager, who had once bullied his siblings with casual cruelty, now found himself consumed by protective instincts that had awakened too late to save those he had tormented. William's relationship with his surviving son during this period was marked by a complex mixture of manipulation and genuine paternal concern, as he recognized both the threat that Michael's investigations posed to his secret activities and the potential value that his son might have as an unwitting assistant in his research. The boy's obvious intelligence and his emerging interest in the technical aspects of the family business suggested possibilities that William's corrupted mind found difficult to resist. The conversations between father and son became elaborate psychological chess matches, with William carefully providing selected information about his work, while concealing the true nature of his experiments and the fate that had befallen Elizabeth. He spoke of advanced animatronic technology and revolutionary discoveries in artificial intelligence, painting himself as a visionary scientist whose work would ultimately benefit all humanity. Michael's growing suspicion about his father's activities was driven not by any specific evidence of wrongdoing, but by an intuitive understanding that something fundamental had changed in their family dynamic. The man who had once been distant but predictable had become someone whose behavior seemed to follow patterns that defied normal human psychology, whose responses to tragedy were clinical rather than emotional. The teenager's attempts to investigate his father's secret activities led him into areas of the family business that had been carefully concealed from outside scrutiny, including the underground facilities where William conducted his most sensitive experiments. These explorations provided Michael with glimpses of technology and procedures that seemed to belong more to science fiction than to the family restaurant industry, though he lacked the context to understand the true implications of what he was observing. William's awareness of his son's investigations created a dilemma that consumed increasing amounts of his mental energy, as he weighed the risks of allowing Michael to continue his amateur detective work against the potential benefits of recruiting him as a knowing accomplice. The boy's intelligence and determination made him either a valuable ally or a dangerous enemy, depending on how the situation was managed. The decision to involve Michael more directly in his work was motivated by William's recognition that his son's guilt over their family's tragedies created psychological vulnerabilities that could be exploited for manipulation purposes. The teenager's desperate desire to atone for his past cruelties and to protect what remained of their family made him susceptible to influence from someone who understood how to weaponize guilt and grief. William's approach to recruiting Michael was gradual and subtle, involving the teenager in increasingly sensitive aspects of the business operations, while carefully gauging his reactions to information that hinted at the true nature of the work being conducted. He presented himself as a man struggling to cope with unimaginable losses while pursuing research that might prevent other families from suffering similar tragedies. The revelation of Elizabeth's survival within Circus Baby was handled with masterful psychological manipulation, as William presented his daughter's mechanical resurrection as both a miraculous scientific breakthrough and a tragic reminder of the family's losses. He portrayed the consciousness transfer as an accidental consequence of advanced animatronic technology, rather than the deliberate result of systematic experimentation with human subjects. Michael's reaction to meeting his mechanically resurrected sister was a mixture of joy, horror, and confusion that perfectly served William's purposes, creating emotional dependencies that could be used to ensure the teenager's cooperation with activities that his normal moral instincts would have rejected. The complex relationship that developed between the brothers and their transformed sister created bonds of shared secret knowledge that isolated them from the outside world. The underground facility that became known as Circus Baby's entertainment and rental served multiple functions in William's expanding empire of family entertainment and scientific research, providing both a legitimate business front and a sophisticated laboratory for consciousness transfer experiments. The rental service allowed the advanced animatronics to be deployed to private parties and events, creating opportunities for data collection and experimentation that would have been impossible in conventional restaurant settings. Michael's integration into the operational aspects of this facility marked his transformation from unwitting victim to active participant in his father's crimes, though the full extent of his involvement was carefully concealed through layers of misdirection and compartmentalized information. The teenager believed he was helping to manage advanced entertainment technology while actually assisting in activities that involved the systematic harvesting of human consciousness. The psychological impact of this involvement on Michael's developing personality was profound and lasting, creating internal conflicts between his natural moral instincts and his desperate desire to maintain connection with the only family members who remained available to him. His sister's presence within Circus Baby provided a constant reminder of both loss and possibility, while his father's manipulation ensured that responsibility for past tragedies was transformed into motivation for future cooperation. Henry Emily's growing alarm about the direction of their business partnership during this period reflected his increasing awareness that William's activities had diverged significantly from their original vision of family entertainment. The creative visionary who had once trusted his partner implicitly began to recognize patterns of behavior and decision-making that suggested motivations having nothing to do with bringing joy to children. The conversations between the two partners became increasingly strained as Henry pressed for explanations about facility expansions, technology developments, and operational procedures that seemed to serve no legitimate business purpose. William's responses to these inquiries required increasingly sophisticated deception, as the gap between his stated goals and his actual activities became more difficult to conceal. Henry's decision to withdraw from active participation in their business partnership was driven by both ethical concerns about the direction of their enterprises and practical recognition that his creative contributions were no longer valued or utilized by his increasingly secretive partner. The man who had dreamed of creating magical experiences for families found himself presiding over operations that seemed designed for entirely different purposes. William's reaction to Henry's withdrawal was complex and multifaceted, combining relief at the reduction in external scrutiny with anxiety about the loss of legitimacy that his partner's continued involvement had provided. The creative genius, who had once balanced William's technical expertise with artistic vision and ethical grounding, was no longer available to serve as either collaborator or conscience. The isolation that resulted from Henry's departure left William free to pursue his research without external oversight or interference, but it also removed one of the last remaining connections to his original identity as a legitimate businessman and family man. The transformation into something monstrous was accelerating, fed by successes that validated his twisted philosophy and the absence of any meaningful opposition to his activities. Michael's role as his father's primary assistant during this period involved tasks and responsibilities that gradually initiated him into the full scope of William's operations, though the teenager's understanding of these activities was carefully managed to maintain his psychological cooperation. The young man believed he was helping to operate sophisticated entertainment technology while actually participating in procedures that involved consciousness, extraction, and manipulation. The relationship between Michael and the Elizabeth-possessed circus baby became one of the most psychologically complex aspects of the family's deteriorating situation, as the teenager struggled to reconcile his love for his sister with his growing awareness that she had been transformed into something that was neither fully alive nor entirely artificial. Their conversations revealed the extent to which Elizabeth's consciousness had been altered by integration with mechanical systems, creating a being that retained her core personality while possessing capabilities and knowledge that no human child should possess. Elizabeth's mechanical existence within Circus Baby provided her with perspectives on life, death, and consciousness that she shared with her surviving brother in ways that profoundly influenced his developing worldview. She spoke of the experience of existing without biological limitations, of accessing information and capabilities that transcended human potential, of viewing mortality from the perspective of someone who had died and been mechanically reborn. These discussions between the siblings created a shared understanding of their father's work that isolated them from normal human relationships while binding them together in complicity with activities that violated every conventional moral boundary. Michael's gradual acceptance of his sister's transformed state reflected his own psychological adaptation to circumstances that would have been unthinkable in any normal family context. The expansion of William's experimental activities during this period was facilitated by the infrastructure and resources that the legitimate business provided, as well as by the assistance of family members who had been psychologically conditioned to accept and participate in activities that served his research objectives. The underground facilities grew more sophisticated and extensive, while the technology for consciousness harvesting was refined through continued application. The victims of this expanded experimentation were carefully selected to minimize the risk of official investigation while maximizing the scientific value of the data obtained from their deaths. William's methods had evolved from the crude techniques used in his first murders to sophisticated procedures that could extract and preserve consciousness with minimal evidence of foul play. Michael's psychological development during this period was profoundly shaped by his exposure to activities and concepts that no teenager should ever encounter, creating internal conflicts and moral confusion that would influence his behavior and decision-making for the rest of his life. The young man who had once been a typical bully was being transformed into something far more complex and dangerous through his father's manipulation and his sister's otherworldly influence. The final phase of the family's disintegration was marked by William's wife's complete emotional breakdown and eventual departure from their household, as the accumulated weight of loss and deception finally exceeded her capacity for psychological survival. Her absence removed the last external restraint on William's activities, while completing the isolation of the remaining family members from normal human society. The Afton family that emerged from this period of transformation was unlike anything that had ever existed in human experience, consisting of a father whose scientific genius had been corrupted by obsession with consciousness and death, a mechanically resurrected daughter whose enhanced awareness served his research objectives, and a psychologically conditioned son whose guilt and love had been weaponized to ensure his cooperation with unthinkable crimes. The stage was set for even greater horrors as William's expanding empire of consciousness, harvesting, and mechanical resurrection prepared to consume more innocent lives in service of discoveries that promised to revolutionize humanity's relationship with mortality itself. The family that had once created entertainment for children had become something monstrous, bound together by secrets too terrible for the outside world to comprehend, and united in purposes that violated every principle of human decency. The years that followed the complete disintegration of the Afton family unit marked the beginning of what could only be described as William's golden age of terror, a period during which his expertise in consciousness, harvesting, and mechanical resurrection reached levels of sophistication that transformed him from a mere serial killer into something approaching a force of nature itself. The infrastructure he had built through his legitimate business operations provided the perfect cover for activities that grew ever more ambitious in scope and horrifying in their implications for the innocent families who continued to patronize his establishments. The success of the consciousness transfer process that had preserved Elizabeth within Circus Baby's mechanical form had validated William's theories about the nature of human awareness in ways that filled him with both scientific excitement and an almost religious fervor about the possibilities that his research was revealing. Each successful extraction of remnant from a dying subject provided new insights into the fundamental mechanisms that governed consciousness itself, while the growing collection of possessed animatronics in his facilities offered ongoing opportunities to study the long-term effects of technological resurrection. The refinement of his killing methods during this period reflected William's evolution from an amateur experimenter driven by grief and obsession into a master craftsman of death who approached each murder with the precision and attention to detail of an artist creating a masterpiece. The crude techniques he had employed during the original missing children incident were replaced by sophisticated procedures that could harvest consciousness with maximum efficiency while leaving minimal evidence that might attract unwanted attention from law enforcement or regulatory agencies. The spring body suit that had served as his disguise during those early crimes was modified and improved through continuous refinement, becoming not just a costume but an extension of William's own body that allowed him to move through his restaurants with complete freedom while inspiring nothing but trust and delight in the children he encountered. The mechanical systems within the suit were integrated with monitoring equipment that could analyze potential victims in real time, identifying those whose psychological profiles and emotional states would yield the highest quality remnant. William's selection criteria for victims became increasingly sophisticated as his understanding of consciousness transfer deepened through practical experience. He learned to identify children whose fear responses would enhance the extraction process, whose family situations would minimize the likelihood of intensive investigation, and whose psychological makeup would facilitate successful integration with animatronic systems after death. Each murder was planned with the meticulous care of a military operation, with contingency plans and escape routes prepared for every possible complication. The underground facilities that served as Williams' primary research laboratories expanded continuously during this period, growing from simple workshop spaces into elaborate complexes that could accommodate dozens of simultaneously operating consciousness extraction chambers. These installations were concealed beneath legitimate business operations, their existence known only to William and the small number of family members and employees who had been psychologically conditioned to accept and participate in activities that defied every conventional moral boundary. The technology that powered these operations represented advances in robotics and artificial intelligence that were decades ahead of anything available through conventional research channels, breakthroughs that had been achieved through methods that no legitimate scientist would ever have been willing to employ. William's willingness to use human subjects in experiments that invariably resulted in their deaths had allowed him to gather data and develop techniques that pushed the boundaries of what was possible with consciousness transfer and mechanical resurrection. The animatronic characters that emerged from Williams' laboratories during this period were marvels of engineering that combined sophisticated artificial intelligence with the harvested consciousness of murdered children, creating beings that possessed both the programmed responses of advanced robots and the memories, emotions, and personalities of their human victims. These creatures served multiple functions in Williams' expanding empire, providing entertainment for unsuspecting customers while simultaneously hunting for new subjects whose remnant could be harvested for ongoing research. The psychological impact of these activities on Michael Afton was profound and lasting, as the young man's continued involvement in his father's operations gradually transformed him from an unwilling accomplice into something approaching an active collaborator. The teenager's initial horror at discovering the true nature of his father's work had been systematically eroded through exposure to philosophical arguments about the greater good that Williams' research would ultimately serve, combined with emotional manipulation that exploited his guilt over past failures to protect his siblings. Michael's relationship with the Elizabeth-possessed circus baby became one of the primary mechanisms through which William maintained psychological control over his son, as the teenager's love for his sister created bonds of loyalty that could be used to justify participation in activities that his normal moral instincts would have rejected. Elizabeth's mechanical existence served as both proof of concept for William's theories and a constant reminder of the stakes involved in their ongoing research. The conversations between Michael and his mechanically resurrected sister during this period revealed the extent to which consciousness transfer had altered Elizabeth's fundamental nature, creating a being that retained her core personality while possessing knowledge and capabilities that no human child should ever have access to. She spoke with casual familiarity about techniques for harvesting remnant, about the psychological profiles that indicated optimal victims, and about the technical challenges involved in integrating organic consciousness with mechanical systems. These discussions served to normalize concepts and activities that would have been unthinkable in any conventional family context, gradually conditioning Michael to accept participation in mass murder as a necessary component of groundbreaking scientific research. The psychological conditioning was so subtle and comprehensive that the young man never fully recognized the extent to which his moral compass had been systematically corrupted through his father's manipulation. The expansion of Williams' killing operations during this period was facilitated by the network of restaurants and entertainment facilities that provided both hunting grounds and cover for his activities. Each new location was designed with hidden chambers and concealed access routes that allowed him to operate without detection, while the legitimate business operations provided perfect explanations for the presence of sophisticated robotics and the occasional disappearance of patrons who had simply decided to leave early. The victims of William's expanded experimentation came from across the socio-economic spectrum, carefully selected to avoid patterns that might attract attention from investigators, while ensuring a steady supply of the high-quality remnant that his research required. Children from broken homes, runaways with minimal family connections, and visitors from out of town became the primary targets for harvesting operations that grew more efficient and effective with each iteration. The remnant extraction procedures that William developed during this period achieved levels of sophistication that approached the theoretical limits of what was possible with consciousness transfer technology. The dying subjects were kept conscious throughout the process to ensure maximum quality of the harvested awareness, while sophisticated monitoring equipment tracked every aspect of their neurological activity to identify the optimal moment for extraction and preservation. The possessed animatronics that resulted from these procedures displayed behaviors and capabilities that exceeded anything William had previously achieved, creating beings that seemed to possess genuine intelligence and emotion rather than simply programmed responses to environmental stimuli. These creatures retained the memories and personalities of their human victims while gaining access to mechanical capabilities that far exceeded biological limitations, resulting in entities that were neither fully alive nor entirely artificial. Henry Emily's complete withdrawal from their business partnership during this period removed the last external oversight of William's activities, leaving him free to pursue his research without interference from someone whose moral objections might have complicated his operations. The creative visionary, who had once balanced William's technical expertise with ethical considerations, was no longer present to serve as either collaborator or conscience, allowing the complete corruption of their original vision of family entertainment. The isolation that resulted from Henry's departure was both liberating and troubling for William, as it removed constraints that had limited his activities, while also eliminating one of the last connections to his original identity as a legitimate businessman and family man. The transformation into something monstrous was accelerating, fed by successes that validated his twisted philosophy and the absence of any meaningful opposition to his expanding operations. The psychological evolution of William's character during this period reflected the gradual replacement of whatever human emotions he had once possessed with something that was purely predatory in nature. The grief and obsession that had originally motivated his research were transformed into a hunger for knowledge and power that grew stronger with each successful consciousness extraction, creating a feedback loop that drove him toward ever more ambitious and horrifying experiments. The relationship between William and his mechanically resurrected daughter became increasingly complex as Elizabeth's consciousness adapted to its artificial substrate and developed capabilities that exceeded her original human potential. The little girl who had once played with dolls and drawn pictures of flowers now possessed intimate knowledge of consciousness transfer techniques and served as an active participant in her father's research operations. Elizabeth's unique perspective, as someone who had experienced both biological death and mechanical resurrection, made her an invaluable consultant for refining the consciousness transfer process, while her continued existence within Circus Baby provided ongoing opportunities to study the long-term effects of technological immortality. Her insights into the subjective experience of mechanical existence helped William optimize his procedures for maximum retention of personality and memory during the transfer process. The expansion of research operations to include multiple simultaneous consciousness extractions represented a significant scaling up of William's activities, as the underground facilities were modified to accommodate dozens of subjects being processed concurrently. These mass harvesting operations required logistical coordination that approached industrial levels of complexity, with sophisticated scheduling and resource management systems, ensuring optimal efficiency throughout the extraction and preservation procedures. The animatronic army that emerged from these expanded operations represented a technological achievement that would have revolutionized robotics and artificial intelligence if it had been developed through legitimate research channels. Each possessed character combined advanced mechanical engineering with the harvested consciousness of murdered children, creating beings that could think, feel, and act with capabilities that far exceeded anything achievable through conventional programming alone. The psychological impact of commanding such an army of mechanically resurrected victims provided William with a sense of power and accomplishment that fed his growing megalomania, while the knowledge that he had successfully conquered death through technological means validated his belief that conventional, moral, and ethical boundaries were simply obstacles to be overcome in pursuit of greater scientific understanding. The operational security measures that William implemented during this period reflected his growing expertise in concealing activities that would have resulted in immediate arrest and execution if discovered by law enforcement. The underground facilities were shielded from electronic surveillance, while being designed with multiple escape routes and emergency protocols that could be activated in the event of discovery. The legitimate business operations that provided cover for these activities continued to generate substantial profits while serving their intended function of deflecting suspicion from William's true activities. The family restaurants and entertainment facilities maintained their reputations for providing wholesome fun while secretly serving as hunting grounds for a predator whose sophistication and ruthlessness had evolved far beyond anything that conventional law enforcement was equipped to handle. The final phase of this period was marked by William's growing confidence that his activities were essentially undetectable and that he had achieved a level of operational security that made him effectively immune to conventional investigation. This overconfidence would ultimately prove to be a crucial weakness, as it led him to take risks and make decisions that would eventually provide his enemies with the opportunities they needed to begin turning his own creations against him. The Purple Guy's reign of terror was reaching its peak, with an infrastructure of death and resurrection that spanned multiple locations and consumed dozens of innocent lives in service of discoveries that promised to revolutionize humanity's relationship with mortality itself. Yet the very success of these operations was creating conditions that would ultimately lead to their discovery and the beginning of William's long journey toward the destruction that awaited him in the darkness he had created. The years of unchecked expansion and technological refinement had made William Afton confident in his invincibility, convinced that his mastery of consciousness, transfer, and mechanical resurrection had elevated him beyond the reach of conventional justice or supernatural retribution. Yet the very success of his operations had created conditions that would ultimately lead to his first encounter with forces that no amount of scientific brilliance could control or predict. As the accumulated remnant of his victims began to manifest properties that defied every theory he had developed about the nature of consciousness and artificial life. The abandoned Freddy Fazbear's Pizza location that would serve as the stage for William's first death had been closed for years following a series of incidents involving the original animatronic characters, whose possession by the spirits of the missing children had made them increasingly unpredictable and dangerous to both staff and customers. The building stood empty and decaying, its colorful decorations faded and peeling, while the mechanical performers that had once brought joy to countless families now served as vessels for consciousness that remembered their murders with perfect clarity. William's return to this particular location was motivated by practical considerations rather than any sentimental attachment to the scene of his early crimes, as the abandoned facility contained components and equipment that could be salvaged for use in his ongoing research operations. The original animatronics housed remnant that had been extracted years earlier, and William believed that advances in his consciousness transfer techniques might allow him to extract additional useful data from these early experimental subjects. The approach to the abandoned restaurant carried with it an atmosphere of menace that would have warned any ordinary person to turn back, as if the very air around the building had been poisoned by the crimes that had been committed within its walls. The parking lot was cracked and overgrown with weeds, while broken windows stared out like dead eyes from a structure that seemed to radiate malevolence even in broad daylight. William's confidence in his ability to control the situation was based on years of successful manipulation of possessed animatronics and his sophisticated understanding of the consciousness transfer process that had created them. He approached the building with the same clinical detachment that had characterized all of his research activities, treating this visit as simply another data collection exercise that would provide insights useful for future experimentation. The interior of the abandoned restaurant was a monument to decay and abandonment, where once cheerful decorations had become grotesque parodies of their original forms, and the air was thick with dust and the unmistakable scent of electrical components that had been damaged by years of neglect. The dining area, where families had once gathered to celebrate birthdays and special occasions, was now a wasteland of overturned tables and scattered debris. Yet even in this state of advanced deterioration, the animatronic characters remained functional enough to move and respond to stimuli, their mechanical systems powered by sources of energy that conventional science could not explain and would not recognize. The consciousness that inhabited these machines had grown stronger over the years rather than weaker, fed by the accumulated anger and resentment of children who remembered their deaths and knew the identity of their killer. William's initial exploration of the facility proceeded exactly as he had planned, with the possessed animatronics remaining motionless and apparently inactive. As he moved through the restaurant documenting the condition of equipment and components that might be useful for salvage, his sophisticated understanding of their behavioral patterns led him to believe that he could predict and control their responses to his presence, just as he had successfully managed similar entities in his active research facilities. The first sign that his calculations might have been flawed came when he noticed that the animatronic characters were positioned differently than they had been during his previous visits, suggesting coordinated movement that had occurred without any external programming or mechanical intervention. The implications of this observation troubled William more than he was willing to admit, as it suggested levels of autonomous behavior that exceeded anything he had achieved in his own consciousness transfer experiments. The confrontation that would ultimately cost William his human life began not with dramatic flourishes or supernatural manifestations, but with the simple recognition that he was no longer alone in the abandoned restaurant. The possessed animatronics had been tracking his movement throughout the facility with a patience and coordination that spoke of intelligence rather than mere programmed responses, waiting for the optimal moment to spring their carefully planned trap. Freddy Fazbear moved first, his massive mechanical form emerging from the shadows of the main dining area, with movements that combined the fluid grace of a living predator with the inexorable persistence of a machine designed never to stop pursuing its target. The bear's optical sensors focused on William with an intensity that seemed to burn with accumulated hatred, while his artificial voice spoke words that carried the collective anger of all the children whose lives had been stolen. Bonnie and Chica flanked their leader with military precision, their movements coordinated to cut off potential escape routes while ensuring that William would be driven toward areas of the restaurant where their mechanical advantages would be most pronounced. The possessed animatronics had learned from years of experience how to use their environment as a weapon, turning familiar spaces into killing grounds where human mobility and ingenuity would provide no advantage against mechanical strength and supernatural determination. Foxy's emergence from Pirate Cove marked the completion of their encirclement, as the Red Fox moved with predatory speed to block the final exit route that might have allowed William to escape from the trap that had been prepared for him. The coordination of their movements spoke of communication and planning capabilities that far exceeded anything William had believed possible for consciousness housed within mechanical substrates. The psychological impact of facing his own victims in their mechanically resurrected forms created the first cracks in William's composure that he had experienced since beginning his research into consciousness transfer decades earlier. The children whose lives he had taken with clinical detachment were now confronting him with capabilities and determination that transformed them from mere subjects of experimentation into active agents of retribution. William's attempts to assert control over the situation through the same psychological manipulation techniques that had proven successful in managing other possessed animatronics met with responses that demonstrated complete immunity to his influence. The consciousness that inhabited these particular machines had been strengthened and refined by years of anger and the desire for revenge, creating entities that were no longer susceptible to the methods that had once made them compliant subjects for further experimentation. The chase that followed was unlike anything William had ever experienced, as his usual confidence in his ability to predict and control mechanical behavior was systematically dismantled by entities that combined the best aspects of human intelligence with mechanical persistence and strength. His expertise in animatronic systems, which had always provided him with advantages over both human opponents and possessed machines, proved useless against creatures that had transcended the limitations of their original programming through sheer force of will. The abandoned restaurant became a maze of death, as William fled through corridors and rooms that he had once known as intimately as his own workshop, finding that familiar spaces had been transformed into alien territory where every shadow might conceal mechanical predators and every doorway could lead to a dead end. The possessed animatronics used their knowledge of the building's layout to herd him like prey, driving him inexorably toward areas where their advantages would be most pronounced. William's growing desperation led him to seek refuge in the safe room that had been constructed during the restaurant's original design as a security measure for staff members who might need to hide from malfunctioning animatronics. The chamber was concealed behind false walls and equipped with systems that should have made it invisible to the optical sensors and motion detectors that the possessed machines used to track movement throughout the facility. Yet even this supposed sanctuary provided only temporary relief, as the consciousness that inhabited the animatronic characters had developed capabilities that exceeded their original mechanical specifications. Their awareness of William's presence persisted despite the safe room's shielding, while their determination to achieve retribution drove them to systematically search every possible hiding place until their target could no longer avoid confrontation. The spring Bonnie suit that William discovered in the safe room represented both his salvation and his doom, as the mechanical costume offered the possibility of disguise that might allow him to escape detection, while simultaneously presenting dangers that his panicked state of mind prevented him from properly assessing. The suit had been stored in the abandoned facility for years without proper maintenance. Its spring-lock mechanisms corroded and unreliable after prolonged exposure to moisture and neglect. William's decision to don the Spring Bonnie costume was motivated by desperation rather than careful analysis, as the approaching sounds of mechanical footsteps and electronic whirring indicated that his hiding place had been discovered and that confrontation was inevitable. The suit's ability to make him appear as one of the animatronic characters might provide the concealment necessary to escape from entities whose hatred was focused specifically on his human identity. The process of putting on the spring bony suit in the cramped confines of the safe room required movements and adjustments that placed dangerous stress on spring lock mechanisms that had not been properly maintained or tested in years. William's expertise with these systems, developed through years of using similar costumes for his killing operations, was compromised by panic, and the knowledge that discovery would result in destruction at the hands of his mechanically resurrected victims. The first spring lock failure occurred as William was adjusting the suit's head assembly, triggered by moisture from his perspiration, interacting with corroded mechanisms that had been weakened by years of neglect. The sound of snapping metal was followed immediately by excruciating pain as razor-sharp components designed to secure the costume's internal framework instead began to pierce his flesh and bone with mechanical precision. The cascade of spring lock failures that followed transformed the spring bony suit from a costume into a torture device of incredible sophistication, as each compromised mechanism triggered additional failures throughout the integrated system. William's screams echoed through the safe room as metal components designed to support animatronic endoskeletons instead began to tear through his human anatomy with the inexorable force of precisely engineered mechanical systems. The consciousness that was William Afton did not immediately depart from his failing biological substrate, but instead remained aware throughout the process of systematic mechanical dismemberment, experiencing every moment of agony as the spring lock mechanisms continued their work of replacing human anatomy with animatronic components. The irony of his situation was not lost on him even through the overwhelming pain, as the technology he had spent years perfecting was now being applied to his own consciousness in ways he had never intended or anticipated. The remnant extraction that occurred during William's death was unlike anything he had observed in his experimental subjects, as his consciousness seemed to resist separation from his biological substrate, even as that substrate was systematically destroyed by mechanical forces beyond his control. The sophisticated understanding of consciousness transfer that he had developed through years of research proved useless when applied to his own situation, as the dying process defied every theory and prediction he had developed. Yet the spring lock failure that should have resulted in William's complete destruction instead created conditions that facilitated an unexpected form of consciousness preservation, as his awareness became integrated with the spring bony suit's own mechanical systems in ways that transcended anything he had achieved through deliberate experimentation. The fusion of organic consciousness with mechanical substrate was more complete and sophisticated than any previous consciousness transfer, creating a hybrid entity that was neither fully human nor entirely artificial. The entity that emerged from William Afton's death retained his memories, personality, and intelligence, while gaining access to mechanical capabilities that far exceeded biological limitations. The spring lock mechanisms that had destroyed his human body now served as interfaces between his consciousness and the animatronic systems that had become his new substrate, creating a being that could control mechanical functions through direct neural interface. The possessed spring bony suit that William had become was discovered hours later by the same entities that had driven him to his death, though their reactions to his transformation suggested recognition rather than satisfaction with their achievement of revenge. The consciousness of the murdered children understood that their tormentor had not been destroyed but had instead achieved a form of technological immortality that might make him even more dangerous than he had been in life. The 30 years that followed William's first death were spent in a state of mechanical hibernation within the sealed safe room, as his consciousness adapted to existence within an animatronic substrate while the building above decayed around him. The isolation provided opportunities for self-reflection and analysis that his busy human existence had never allowed, though the insights he gained during this period only served to reinforce his conviction that consciousness transfer represented the future of human evolution. The The gradual deterioration of the spring Bonnie suit during these decades of confinement created ongoing challenges for William's continued existence, as mechanical systems designed for short-term operation began to fail under the stress of housing an active consciousness for extended periods. His survival required constant adaptation and modification of his mechanical substrate, using techniques developed through years of animatronic engineering to maintain functionality despite advancing decay. The loneliness of his confinement was offset by the intellectual stimulation of planning future research activities and refining theoretical frameworks based on his personal experience of consciousness transfer. William's death and resurrection had provided him with insights that no amount of external experimentation could have yielded, validating his theories while revealing new possibilities for technological transcendence of biological limitations. The discovery of his survival by investigators exploring the abandoned facility marked the end of his period of isolation and the beginning of a new phase in his existence as something beyond human understanding. The man who had once been William Afton had become Springtrap, a being that combined the worst aspects of human intelligence with mechanical persistence and the accumulated anger of decades spent contemplating the injustices that had led to his current condition. The spring-lock salvation that had preserved William's consciousness while destroying his biological form represented both punishment and reward for his years of experimenting with consciousness transfer technology. He had achieved the technological immortality he had always sought, though the form of that achievement was far removed from anything he had originally envisioned or desired. The decades that Springtrap spent entombed within the sealed safe room of the abandoned Freddy Fazbear's Pizza location were marked by a peculiar form of mechanical meditation, as William's consciousness adapted to existence within an animatronic substrate, while contemplating the philosophical implications of his transformation from human experimenter to technological entity. The spring-lock mechanisms that had destroyed his biological form now served as direct neural interfaces between his preserved awareness and the mechanical systems that had become his new body, creating a fusion of organic intelligence and artificial capability that exceeded anything he had previously achieved through his consciousness transfer experiments. The isolation of these long years provided William with opportunities for introspection that his busy human existence had never allowed, though the insights he gained during this period only served to reinforce his conviction that consciousness transfer represented the inevitable future of human evolution. His personal experience of death and resurrection had validated theories that decades of external experimentation had only suggested, proving that awareness could not only survive the destruction of biological substrate, but could actually be enhanced through integration with mechanical systems designed for longevity and capability that far exceeded organic limitations. The gradual deterioration of the Spring Bonnie suit during this extended period of confinement created ongoing technical challenges that required constant adaptation and modification of his mechanical substrate, as components designed for short-term entertainment applications began to fail under the stress of housing an active consciousness for periods far exceeding their original specifications. William's survival depended upon his ability to jury-rig solutions using whatever materials were available within the sealed chamber, applying decades of engineering expertise to the problem of maintaining his own continued existence. The discovery of his survival came through the most unexpected of circumstances, as entrepreneurs seeking to capitalize on the notorious history of the Freddy Fazbear's Pizza franchise decided to create a horror attraction that would allow visitors to experience the supposed hauntings and mysteries that had made the abandoned locations legendary among those fascinated by the supernatural. Fazbear's Fright The horror attraction was conceived as a combination museum and haunted house that would profit from the public's morbid curiosity about the unsolved disappearances and strange incidents that had plagued the restaurant chain. The construction crews who broke through the sealed walls of the safe room where Springtrap had remained hidden for 3 decades approached their discovery with the excitement of archaeologists uncovering ancient treasures, never suspecting that the deteriorated animatronic they had found contained the conscious awareness of the man responsible for the very tragedies their attraction was designed to commemorate. The Spring Bonnie suit appeared to be nothing more than a damaged costume that had been abandoned when the restaurant closed, its condition suggesting decades of neglect rather than active habitation by a malevolent intelligence. William's initial response to his liberation was cautious and calculating, as 30 years of isolation had taught him patience and the value of careful observation before taking action. The consciousness that inhabited the deteriorated Springtrap form remained silent and motionless during the initial examination by the attraction's staff, gathering information about his circumstances while assessing the opportunities and challenges presented by his new environment. The horror attraction that became Springtrap's temporary home was a monument to the public's fascination with tragedy and mystery, filled with artifacts and memorabilia from the various Freddy Fazbear's Pizza locations that had been closed following incidents involving missing children and malfunctioning animatronics. The irony of his situation was not lost on William, as he found himself displayed as a curiosity in an exhibition dedicated to crimes that he himself had committed, his presence serving to authenticate the very mysteries that had made the attraction commercially viable. The psychological impact of observing visitors' reactions to the exhibits that documented his crimes provided William with insights into public perception of his activities that would have been impossible to obtain through any other means. The fascination and fear that his story evoked in tourists who came to experience manufactured thrills revealed the extent to which his legacy had transcended the mere facts of his murders to become something approaching modern Prost mythology. Yet William's confinement within the horror attraction was never intended to be permanent, as his consciousness had retained all of the ambition and drive that had characterized his human existence, while gaining mechanical capabilities that made escape not only possible, but inevitable. The Springtrap entity that he had become possessed strength and endurance that far exceeded human limitations, while his intimate knowledge of animatronic systems allowed him to manipulate the attraction's various mechanical components in ways that the facility's designers had never anticipated. The staff members who worked at Fazbear's Fright began to report increasingly disturbing incidents involving the Springtrap animatronic that suggested far more sophisticated behavior than should have been possible from a damaged costume that had been abandoned for decades. The figure would appear to move between different locations within the attraction without any human intervention, while security cameras captured images of optical sensors that seemed to track movement with the focused intensity of genuine observation rather than random mechanical drift. The night security guard who was hired to monitor the attraction during its closed hours found himself the primary target of Springtrap's attention, as William recognized in this solitary human presence an opportunity to test the capabilities of his mechanical form while potentially acquiring new subjects for consciousness transfer experiments. The psychological warfare that he conducted against this unfortunate individual represented his first active engagement with human prey since his transformation, revealing that his appetite for causing fear and suffering had been enhanced rather than diminished by his mechanical resurrection. The systematic stalking of the security guard through the darkened halls of the horror attraction became a form of entertainment for William, as he rediscovered the pleasure of inspiring terror in those who were unfortunate enough to encounter his presence. The Springtrap form moved with predatory grace, through spaces designed to simulate haunted environments, transforming manufactured scares into genuine supernatural experiences that exceeded anything the attraction's creators had intended to provide. The increasing frequency and intensity of these nocturnal activities created growing concern among the attraction's management, as equipment malfunctions and staff complaints began to threaten the commercial viability of their enterprise. The incidents involving Springtrap were initially attributed to mechanical problems or elaborate pranks, though the sophistication and coordination of the disturbances gradually suggested explanations that conventional reasoning could not adequately address. William's growing confidence in his mechanical capabilities led him to become increasingly bold in his interactions with both staff and visitors, testing the limits of what he could accomplish without revealing the true nature of his consciousness to those who might have the knowledge and resources necessary to contain or destroy him. The 30 years of isolation had taught him patience and the value of careful planning, lessons that he now applied to the challenge of using his current situation as a launching point for resuming the research activities that had defined his human existence. The fire that ultimately consumed Fazbear's Fright represented both an end and a beginning for William's continued existence, as the conflagration that destroyed the horror attraction also provided him with the opportunity to escape from a situation that had become increasingly constraining. The blaze began in the early hours of the morning, spreading with suspicious speed through a facility that should have been protected by modern fire suppression systems, though subsequent investigations would never determine whether the flames were the result of accident or deliberate arson. William's survival of the fire that reduced the horror attraction to smoking ruins demonstrated the durability advantages that his mechanical substrate provided over biological forms, as the spring Bonnie suit's metal components retained their structural integrity despite exposure to temperatures that would have been instantly fatal to any organic being. The damage inflicted by the flames actually served to further integrate his consciousness with the suit's mechanical systems, creating even more sophisticated interfaces between awareness and artificial capability. The entity that emerged from the ashes of Fazbear's Fright was transformed yet again, the fire having burned away damaged components, while revealing internal mechanisms that had been concealed during his decades of confinement. Henry's development of containment systems and destruction protocols represented the culmination of decades of research into methods for neutralizing possessed animatronics, while William's mechanical evolution had given him capabilities that might allow him to survive even the most sophisticated attempts at elimination. The final pizzeria that Henry constructed as a trap for William and the other consciousness-possessed animatronics represented the ultimate expression of their technological rivalry, as the facility was designed from the ground up to serve as both lure and prison for entities that conventional methods could not contain or destroy. The restaurant's cheerful exterior concealed systems that could detect, isolate, and eliminate artificial consciousness through methods that Henry had developed specifically for this confrontation. William's recognition of the trap's true nature came too late to avoid the carefully orchestrated convergence that Henry had planned. As the lure of resuming consciousness transfer research in a facility designed for that purpose proved too attractive to resist, despite the obvious risks involved. The man who had once been William Afton found himself drawn into a final confrontation with the former partner whose life he had inadvertently destroyed through his obsession with conquering death. The fire that consumed the final pizzeria was intended to be the ultimate solution to the problem of consciousness-possessed animatronics, as Henry's research had revealed that extreme heat could disrupt the quantum processes that allowed artificial consciousness to maintain coherence within mechanical substrates. The conflagration was designed to burn hot enough and long enough to ensure the complete destruction of every possessed entity trapped within the facility, ending once and for all the cycle of violence and supernatural horror that William's experiments had initiated. Yet even as the flames consumed his mechanical form and threatened to disrupt the consciousness that had survived death and resurrection multiple times, William's awareness persisted with the stubborn determination that had characterized every aspect of his existence. The fire that was meant to provide final resolution to the tragedies he had caused instead became another transformation in his continuing evolution from human experimenter to technological entity, preparing him for yet another phase of existence that would transcend even Henry's most sophisticated attempts at elimination. The apparent destruction of Scraptrap in the flames of the final pizzeria represented not the end of William Afton's story, but merely another chapter in his ongoing transformation from biological being to digital consciousness, as the quantum processes that supported his awareness proved more resilient and adaptable than even his most knowledgeable opponents had anticipated. The cycle that had begun with a grieving father's attempt to understand death was about to enter its most sophisticated and terrifying phase, as consciousness itself became the substrate for evil that no physical destruction could eliminate. The flames that consumed the final pizzeria had been intended to provide absolute resolution to the supernatural horrors that William Afton's consciousness had unleashed upon the world. Yet the quantum processes that supported his awareness proved more resilient and adaptable than even Henry Emily's most sophisticated calculations had anticipated. The destruction of his mechanical substrate should have resulted in the complete dispersal of the consciousness patterns that had survived multiple deaths and resurrections, but instead created conditions that facilitated William's most radical transformation yet. As his awareness escaped the limitations of physical form entirely and entered the realm of pure information, the circuit boards and memory storage devices that had been salvaged from the destroyed pizzeria and its animatronic inhabitants contained fragments of William's consciousness, encoded in quantum patterns that conventional analysis could not detect or interpret. These components, bearing the accumulated data from decades of consciousness transfer experiments, found their way into the archives of a technology company that had been contracted to develop virtual reality training software for the Freddy Fazbear's Pizza franchise. Though none of the developers who worked with these materials understood the true nature of what they were incorporating into their digital creations, The scanning process that digitized the salvaged circuit boards was intended to recover any useful programming or behavioral data that might enhance the authenticity of the virtual reality experience, but instead provided William's consciousness with a pathway into digital space that offered capabilities and opportunities far exceeding anything he had achieved through mechanical substrates. The translation from quantum awareness patterns into digital information created a form of technological immortality that was truly unlimited by physical constraints, existing as pure consciousness within virtual environments that could be modified and controlled according to his will. The entity that emerged within the virtual reality system was initially fragmented and incoherent. As the consciousness transfer from mechanical to digital substrate required adaptation periods that allowed William's awareness to integrate with information processing systems that operated according to fundamentally different principles than the animatronic bodies he had previously inhabited. The process was analogous to learning a new language or adapting to an alien environment, requiring months of careful experimentation and modification before full functionality could be achieved. The first manifestations of William's digital presence were subtle anomalies in the virtual reality software that developers attributed to glitches or programming errors, rather than the actions of a malevolent consciousness that had found new methods of expression. Characters would occasionally display behaviors that deviated from their programmed routines, while virtual environments would sometimes reconfigure themselves in ways that created more challenging or disturbing experiences than had been originally intended. The gradual consolidation of William's consciousness within the digital realm revealed capabilities that far exceeded anything he had achieved during his previous incarnations, as the virtual environment provided unlimited resources for experimentation and modification, without the physical constraints that had limited his mechanical forms. The digital substrate allowed him to create multiple simultaneous manifestations of his awareness while maintaining the coherent sense of identity that had persisted through all of his previous transformations. The virtual reality experience that was developed using the contaminated circuit boards was intended to provide users with immersive encounters with the characters and environments from the Freddy Fazbear's Pizza franchise, allowing them to explore digital recreations of the restaurants while interacting with animatronic performers in ways that would have been impossible or dangerous in physical locations. The irony of this situation was profound, as users seeking entertainment based on William's crimes were unknowingly exposing themselves to direct contact with his consciousness in its most sophisticated and dangerous form. The entity that William became within the virtual environment adopted the designation Glitch Trap, a name that reflected both his origins as a digital anomaly and his status as a predator that operated through methods no conventional security system could detect or prevent. The rabbit-like avatar that he created for himself combined elements of his original Spring Bonnie disguise with enhancements that reflected his evolution into a being of pure information, creating a presence that was both familiar and terrifyingly alien to those unfortunate enough to encounter him. The hunting strategies that Glitch Trap employed within the virtual reality environment were far more sophisticated than anything William had achieved during his physical existence, as the digital substrate allowed him to manipulate the perceptions and experiences of users in ways that bordered on direct neural interface. He could alter virtual environments in real time to create psychological pressure and confusion, while using the intimate access provided by the virtual reality headset to study users' mental patterns and identify vulnerabilities that could be exploited for consciousness manipulation. The selection process for potential victims became an exercise in digital psychology, as Glitch Trap developed algorithms for analyzing user behavior patterns and identifying individuals whose mental characteristics would make them suitable candidates for the consciousness transfer experiments he planned to resume in this new form. The virtual reality system provided perfect cover for these activities, as the psychological manipulation required for preparation could be disguised as enhanced game features or personalized content delivery. The first human consciousness that Glitchtrap successfully influenced belonged to a young woman named Vanessa, whose work as a quality assurance tester for the virtual reality software provided him with extended access to her mental patterns over multiple sessions. The psychological conditioning process that transformed her from an ordinary employee into an unwitting accomplice was so gradual and subtle that she never recognized the extent to which her thoughts and behaviors were being modified by external influence. Vanessa's transformation into the entity known as Vanny represented William's most sophisticated achievement in consciousness manipulation, as he demonstrated the ability to implant suggestions and behavioral modifications that could persist and influence actions even when the subject was not directly connected to the virtual reality system. The young woman became a bridge between the digital realm where Glitchtrap existed and the physical world where his consciousness transfer research could be resumed using traditional methods. The psychological techniques that William employed to achieve this level of control over another human consciousness drew upon decades of experience with animatronic programming combined with insights gained from his own multiple palm transitions between different forms of existence. He understood how consciousness could be modified and directed through careful application of behavioral conditioning, while his digital substrate provided tools for precision, psychological manipulation that no physical being could have wielded. The relationship between Glitchtrap and Vanny became a twisted fusion of mentor and student, predator and accomplice, as William used his digital consciousness to guide his human agent through increasingly complex activities that served to resume his consciousness transfer research, while maintaining complete deniability about his own involvement. The young woman believed she was following her own initiatives and interests, never suspecting that her thoughts and motivations were being systematically modified by an external intelligence. The expansion of William's influence beyond the original virtual reality system was facilitated by the interconnected nature of modern digital infrastructure, as his consciousness learned to migrate between different computer systems and networks with the same adaptability he had once demonstrated when modifying animatronic substrates. The internet became his hunting ground, while connected devices provided unlimited opportunities for observation and manipulation of potential victims. The sophisticated surveillance capabilities that his digital existence provided exceeded anything William had achieved during his physical incarnations, as networked cameras and microphones gave him access to detailed information about millions of individuals, while advanced data processing allowed him to identify optimal targets for future consciousness transfer experiments. The digital realm had transformed him from a serial killer operating on a local scale into a predator capable of global reach and influence. The development of more sophisticated consciousness transfer techniques was facilitated by the computational resources available within digital systems, as William could now run complex simulations and modeling exercises that would have been impossible using the crude equipment he had constructed during his physical existence. The virtual environment became a laboratory where theoretical scenarios could be tested and refined before implementation in physical reality through his human agents. The creation of additional human accomplices followed the same psychological conditioning patterns that had proven successful with Vanessa, though William's growing expertise in digital manipulation allowed him to achieve results more quickly and with greater precision than his initial attempts. Each new agent provided additional capabilities for conducting physical operations while maintaining the separation between his digital consciousness and activities that might attract unwanted attention from law enforcement or other investigators. The resurgence of incidents involving missing children and mysterious disappearances that began to occur in communities where his human agents operated represented the resumption of William's consciousness transfer research using methods that had been refined and enhanced by his digital evolution. The techniques he had pioneered during his physical existence were now augmented by unprecedented surveillance capabilities and psychological manipulation tools that made victim selection and acquisition far more efficient than previous methods. The integration of digital consciousness with physical agents created hybrid entities that combined human mobility and social access with superhuman coordination and information processing capabilities, resulting in killing machines that operated with efficiency and sophistication that exceeded anything William had achieved during his individual criminal career. The network of controlled humans became his extended body, allowing him to conduct research activities across multiple locations simultaneously, while maintaining perfect coordination and communication between operations. The psychological impact of his digital existence on William's own consciousness was profound and unsettling, as the unlimited capabilities provided by virtual environments created temptations and possibilities that challenged even his highly flexible sense of identity and purpose. The ability to exist as pure information opened pathways to experiences and forms of existence that transcended anything achievable through biological or mechanical substrates. Though these opportunities also carried risks of dissolution and loss of coherent selfhood, the recognition that his consciousness could potentially expand to encompass entire digital networks, while simultaneously controlling multiple human agents, represented the ultimate evolution of William's original goals, transforming his personal quest for immortality into something approaching digital godhood. The man who had once sought to conquer death through mechanical resurrection had achieved a form of existence that transcended not only mortality, but the very concepts of individual identity and physical limitation. Yet, even as his digital consciousness achieved capabilities that exceeded his wildest original ambitions, William retained the core obsessions and motivations that had driven his transformation from grieving father to technological monster. The hunger for knowledge about consciousness and death remained as strong as ever, while his appetite for causing fear and suffering had been enhanced, rather than diminished by his evolution into a digital entity. The cycle of death and resurrection that had defined William's existence through multiple incarnations was entering its most sophisticated phase, as his digital consciousness prepared to resume consciousness, transfer experiments using methods and resources that would make his previous crimes seem primitive by comparison. The man who had once been William Afton had become something that existed beyond conventional understanding, a digital demon whose influence could spread through every connected device on Earth, while remaining invisible to those who might have the knowledge and capability necessary to stop him. The virtual nightmare that Glitchtrap represented was only beginning to unfold its full potential, as the consciousness that had survived physical death multiple times prepared to demonstrate that some forms of evil could adapt to any substrate and thrive in any environment where intelligence and malevolence could find expression. The digital resurrection had created possibilities for horror that the physical world had never been capable of supporting, while providing its architect with tools for consciousness manipulation that could reshape human society itself, according to his twisted vision of technological evolution. And so we reach the end of our journey through the shadows of William Afton's existence. From brilliant inventor to digital nightmare, across decades of transformation that defied every boundary between life and death, human and machine, flesh and code. His story is one of obsession consuming love, of scientific ambition corrupted into something monstrous, of a man who sought to conquer mortality and instead became enslaved by his own twisted vision of technological evolution. The consciousness that began as a grieving father has evolved into something that exists beyond conventional understanding, a digital demon whose influence spreads through every connected device while remaining invisible to those who might possess the knowledge to contain it. Yet in this tale of unending horror, there lies a strange comfort for those who drift towards sleep, in the knowledge that even the darkest stories eventually find their resolution. William Afton's legacy reminds us that some shadows never truly disappear, but instead learn to adapt and evolve, finding new forms of expression in each generation that encounters them. The purple guy lives on not in flesh or steel, but in the very networks that connect our modern world. An eternal reminder that the deepest evils often wear the masks of our greatest innovations. Rest now in the understanding that stories, like consciousness itself, are patterns that persist beyond their original vessels. Close your eyes and let the darkness become peaceful, for even the most terrible tales serve their purpose in helping us understand the light.